Who's got that?
Mr. Chairman, we're ready to begin. Senator Ellis. Senator Beitman. Senator Salazar. Senator Rothfuss. Representative Andrew. Representative Brown.
Here.
Representative Connolly. Representative Harshman. Representative Nyman. Representative Newsom. Representative Obermueller. Representative Summers. Co-Chairman Paxton. Co-Chairman Scott. You have a quorum.
Okay, very good. First order of business is adoption of the interim committee rules. They're pretty plain vanilla standard rules that the interim committees have generally operated under. The choice that arises is whether to sponsor a bill, we're going to require a majority from each house, or whether a simple majority of the committee will do. Frankly, I've seen it done both ways, and Chairman Paxton and I talked it over, and we're going to recommend to you that we adopt the version that simply requires a majority of the committee. That seems in general to work best, and we don't see any issues coming up in the next 2 years that are likely to be one house against the other. If it turns out there is one that way, the simple remedy, you gotta pay attention, try to reach a compromise, because a bill that was all one house and none of the other would have a certain difficulty being even heard in the second house. So I think it's incumbent on us to just realize that as a practical matter, and that we really need to strive to get a pretty good consensus when we bring something forward, if we're going to expect it to pass. So do I hear a motion to adopt the interim rules?
I move a motion that the temporary rules would be our permanent rules and standard rules used by this.
Second. Moved and seconded. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That carried. Okay, first real item of business, having disposed of that, is K-2 school finances. And we're going to go through that, the education program from the point of view of the State Board of Education. And then the issues regarding the feds. The point in doing that, we've got a lot of members on the committee that are either new to the committee and some that are new to the legislature as well. Some of the rest of us, I was on this committee 20 years ago, but not since. So we figured having a good understanding of the rules and of the system and the current financial status that we've got was very important. So we've asked LSO to take us through that, and I expect they'll concentrate to some extent on the briefing materials that are there. And we're going to go slowly and invite questions as we go along. This is your chance to get a good understanding of really where we stand on things and how our system works and the strengths and weaknesses of it. So feel free to interrupt and ask questions. And LSO, let me ask you a technical question before we get going. We will have people participating via Zoom. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, that is correct. And you'll actually see Superintendent Balo
Yeah, okay.
is,
I was wondering, I can't see the screen as well as I might, so.
yeah, and
And
my understanding is she wants to provide some general comments to the committee. And if you want to do that before we get into the agenda, that,
yeah, Superintendent Balo, with that, can you hear us? Do you want to provide us with some general comments before we really get going?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Well, greetings, and I apologize that I can't be there in person. I'm struggling with some laryngitis and other stuff, so figured it'd be better to stay at home. You're going to hear a lot today from great minds, including those up on the dais, so I'll be really brief, but I just wanted to.
Oh, the Zoom froze up.
Is it unfrozen now? There. Are we unfrozen?
Yeah, now we're on frost.
All right, well, I will be very brief. I just want to take a moment and first and foremost, thank you all for your service to Wyoming in one of the most incredibly challenging times. I'm hoping you can still hear me. Okay.
Superintendent Balo, can you
Yes.
hear us?
Yes.
Okay, let's try again.
All right. Well, you're going to hear from so many great minds, including those on the dais today. So I'll be very brief. And I want to just first and foremost, thank you all for your service to Wyoming in one of the most challenging times in our history. Our partnership across the executive and legislative branches this past school year has enabled our local school districts to accomplish what no one in the nation did, and arguably no one in the world did as well as we did here in Wyoming. And our children and families, as you know, will benefit from that for years to come. I anticipate a smooth opening to school this year. And we know that from past experience, which is unlike most other states. Your agenda today focuses on K-12 education finance, programming, and the ESSER or ARPA funds from the U.S. Department of Education. We all know that these are issues of great importance in the present and the future. And I've had an opportunity to speak with many of you in your home districts and on the phone and via Zoom over the last couple of months. And I really, really appreciate those conversations. I appreciate your thoughtful wisdom, advice, and ongoing communication. And I believe that regardless of whether we have another pandemic, continued funding woes, blizzards, or business as usual, that our education system will remain strong in Wyoming because of your leadership. So thank you very much. Your conversations today are going to really shore up some issues, including finance, retooling our expectations for education, absenteeism, and options for families. And those are all so vitally important. And I know each of you has a different passion and focus, but you all realize the importance of every single one of the issues that we face. I just wanted to spend a moment talking about the ESSER funding. You know that ESSER 1 and ESSER 2 are already out and available and being spent by school districts. And as they determine best, there's a lot of flexibility with those federal funds, perhaps more than we've ever seen with any other program. ESSER 3, or the ARPA funds, still remains at the state level. It has not been allocated to schools yet, pending answers from the U.S. Department of Education on how the strings that are attached to this funding will impact our state. We did receive an update from the U.S. Department of Education late Friday afternoon that they're working on our questions. And so hopefully we'll get some clarity this week. I'm very proud of how the LSO, the governor's office, my office, and our federal delegation have worked closely together to ensure that we can receive the ESSER 3 or the ARPA funds with confidence. And Team Wyoming will continue to push, including our federal delegation and our offices. Tomorrow's focus on K through 3 reading, absenteeism, and the Hathaway Scholarship are so exciting for me. We've made so many great strides in those areas, and it's due to your legislative action that we as a state have had a strong backbone or core to which attach and do the great work for our students. Finally, just a non-agenda item, bit of news, but it's really exciting. Tonight, Cheyenne and Wyoming begin hosting the Summer Leadership Conference for the National Association of State Superintendents. It's called the Council of Chief State School Officers, or CCSSO. This is the first time that they've had a meeting this large in Wyoming. And we have 37 states that are RSVP'd to attend the week of programming here in Wyoming and experience Wyoming culture, including a rodeo. I'm excited to share our successes with them, and we'll certainly be referring to you all throughout the meeting and the partnership that we share. So good luck in your discussions. Again, I'm sorry that I can't be there in person. I appreciate your dedication, your interest, and your commitment to education in Wyoming, Mr. Chairman, and would stand for any additional comments or questions from the committee.
Okay, let me ask one to start with. This afternoon, we're scheduled to get to a section on the federal funding, the ARPA or ESSER 3, I guess you're calling it now. Will there be a member of your staff available to us either here or via Zoom that is familiar with the current status of our negotiations with the feds on that?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for that question. And yes, there will be multiple staff members who can answer questions. In addition, it's not particularly rare for Wyoming, but rare in other states, that the LSO, our staff, and the governor's office really all have the same information and are proceeding in lockstep with one another. So I believe that the answers that we have, the information that we know, can be shared with the committee today if there are questions, and if there aren't, we'll add them to our list to ask the U.S. Department of Education. And I want to be really clear, Mr. Chairman, that the U.S. Department of Education is not necessarily dragging their feet to not give us answers. It's that Wyoming has a unique issue. We have equitable funding, which no other state has to the extent that we have. And we risk being penalized for our equitable funding system with some of these funds. And so the questions that we ask are challenging and precedent setting for the U.S. Department of Education. They're taking their time to answer the questions because it's likely that other states that aren't as far down this path as we are will have similar questions in the future.
Committee? Seeing nothing, thank you very much. Appreciate your words and your participation. And we appreciate your you and your staff participating as we proceed today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee.
Okay, LSO, now I think we're ready for you to start. And again, committee, if you've got questions as we go through, this is the chance to get our understanding. So don't be bashful. We've, I think, allowed quite a bit of time for this because I think there will be some questions, should be. Proceed. How are you going to proceed with this? Go through the handout, or how are you going to handle it?
Mr. Chairman, Tanya Heidrich with the Legislative Service Office. I can begin if you'd like. As part of your interim topics, one of your interim topics was to review the recalibration process and explore alternative approaches for the recalibration. And so in that vein, we prepared a memo. It's dated July 1st of 2020. It's included in your meeting material. And I'll go ahead and cover some of the highlights included therein. And as Mr. Chairman stated, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to stop me and let me know. Wyoming's Constitution contains a number of provisions governing education. And in addition, over the course of the last 30 years, a variety of cases have been heard by the Wyoming Supreme Court on this topic. As part of that effort, the Supreme Court provided some guidance to the legislature, and I'll just read a brief quote, which was to provide an equal opportunity for a quality education by structuring both the school financing and the education system in a manner and at a level that maintains a complete and uniform system of public instruction and a thorough and efficient system of public schools adequate for the proper instruction of the youth of all states. In that vein, they directed that the legislature first define the educational package that every student is entitled to across the state. So whether you live in Sundance or whether you live in Cheyenne, every student is entitled to the same educational package. That is now known as the basket of goods, and that's identified in a number of different statutes and also has an important role with the state board. Recalibration, after identifying the basket, the legislature is required to identify the cost of that basket. That's been historically accomplished through a number of consultants. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then thirdly, the legislature is then required to fund that basket. Recalibration relates to the second item, which is costing the basket of goods. In some of the court cases, the Supreme Court recognized that while relying on expenditure-based models as an appropriate means to meet your constitutional obligation, they required that you routinely, they said not less than every 5 years, look at those model components and determine the cost of those. In recognition of the court's directive in 2003, Mr. Chairman?
With a question.
Sure.
On the bottom of the first page in the briefing memorandum, you do speak of determining the cost of the educational panel. And that has always troubled me because it strikes me that this is not like, you know, building a bridge or building this kind of a building where you set the specifications of the building and you can pretty well, the experts can cost it out. I've always had trouble that there was a single cost of education. And let me explain. In a lot of education, it seems to me that the smaller the class size, the better the ratio of the number of teachers to the students, and the smaller number of students per teacher, the better you get, all the way down to a class size of 1, which is an individual tutor. And yet it's totally impractical, as we all know, to go anywhere near that far. And so it doesn't seem to me like there is a single cost of education. There are multiple costs depending on how much you can afford to buy and how much you think is worth buying. What kind of guidance does the court decisions give us on this subject of how we look at the cost of education?
Mr. Chairman, it's been a sort of an evolving process over the course of the history. And so I think initially it was sort of this classroom unit notion, which was a much larger sort of generic identification of the costs associated with educating students. Over the course of the history of school finance, you've identified adjustments like at-risk or special education, transportation, certified staff, groundskeepers, routine maintenance. Sort of as time has gone on, your model has become, I would say, more complex, but also more accurately reflecting finite items within the delivery of education. Does that answer your question? No. Okay. Let me try again. Go ahead.
What I'm really concerned about is that I don't see that there is any such thing as a cost of education. There are multiple costs depending on how far you're going in terms of the quality. And it seems to me we, as a practical matter, that's what the legislature does in every area. We decide so much is worth doing and so much is not. And the cost of doing the extra gets to be a little more. And I'm wondering what kind of guidance we have, because it seems to me we're dealing with something that isn't fully realistic when we just speak of a cost of education.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And, you know, it is, you know, I'm not an expert on the court opinions. Oop, I gotta move that again. Oh. But at first, capital construction wasn't included in the court decision. So that was, you know, they held the more basic classroom elements as part of the discussion. But I think in Campbell 4, or I think it was Campbell 4, they actually brought in capital construction. And so I think the cost, when you state the cost of education, I think that evolved in the court decisions over time, exactly what the cost of education was. And it got down to even the points of what should be included in that discussion. Certainly once you define the basket, but then it looked at class size, it looked at a whole variety of things, that they being the courts. So yeah, I think the cost of education includes all of those things that were in the court decision.
Mr. Chairman, I can also provide this. The court did recognize that one option capable of supporting a constitutionally acceptable school finance system is based on expenditures. And so long as the state relies on an expenditure-based model, it's required to review the costs associated with that. And to Representative Summers' point, each model component was reviewed in the last Campbell case. In the Campbell 4 case, it was a 6 week bench trial. They heard everything from certified personnel to the at-risk adjustment. Every line item was reviewed by the court. So to your point, this is the way that Wyoming has decided to fund education, relying on expenditures based, and this is the cost that they have adopted over the course of 20 years of school finance. And as Mr. Wilmer just pointed out, you've utilized a number of different consultants in that effort as well. And so when you're talking about the cost, part of that is driven by the legislative action, the policies that they have adopted, like small class sizes. Others have been directed by your consultants that you've relied on over the course of the last 20 years.
Okay, and that's useful. I do think what it really says to me is there is some legislative discretion, as there has to be, in terms of what we define as the cost, how far we go in it, and the real way we could get in trouble is by not being consistent through the whole system, and from particularly making any kind of wealth-based distinction where what it cost in your district is more than it costs mine because you got more assessed valuation to support it. And that's one thing that's quite clear to me the court would not tolerate. Is that a fair reading of them?
Mr. Chairman, I would certainly agree that the court prohibited funding on wealth-based disparities across the state.
Chairman Paxton just said he thought the biggest thing that we had control over was class size that affects it. So I think that's exactly right.
Mr. Chairman, I'll continue. The legislature responded to the court's directive to review the cost of the educational basket by enacting 2113-309T, which requires that not less than every 5 years, the legislature engage in recalibration of the model and make modifications that are necessary to reflect the cost of the educational basket. The court, to your point, Mr. Chairman, has recognized and did recognize in releasing jurisdiction in the last case, the legislature's commitment to education. And they didn't dictate a specific process for recalibration, but they did say so long as you're relying on expenditure-based model, you must recost it every 5 years. And they also recognize to start from scratch every 5 years is costly and unduly burdensome on the state. The legislature has performed a number of recalibrations. The first real recalibration was conducted in 2001 and actually spanned 4 years. It resulted in 30 studies. It would be too cumbersome and burdensome to go over all those today, but those are contained on our website if you'd like to peruse those. It included modifications to the cost-based prototypical schools, including revision of employee compensation, out-of-state tuition, at-risk, small schools, small school districts, transportation, routine maintenance and operation, and a number of other modifications. That was performed by a consultant commonly known as MAP, which is Management Analysis and Planning Incorporated. The second recalibration was performed in 2005, and that work began with Larry Pikus and Associates. And the state has had a long-standing relationship with that particular consultant. It included incorporating the model spreadsheets into law, which I know has been a large discussion over the course of the last year, and some discussion about incorporating those into the green books. Another recalibration in 2010. That was more of a desk audit, so they didn't recost every single element of the model. Because of the robust data that the state had, they were able to review that along with how districts deployed it, and based on that, made a number of changes, technical changes to the model. As a result of that effort, you also enacted a provision to monitor labor markets and the external cost adjustment annually. That work has been performed by Dr. Lori Taylor and Dr. Chris Stoddard in conjunction with Larry Pikus. Through that effort, you adopted it actually through statute to ensure that you receive that annually. That report, I believe they receive in October. And additionally, that was when the legislature adopted the Wyoming Accountability in Education Act. That's your teacher leader accountability system.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So at that point, for a period of time, so the courts basically mandated an ECA, an external cost adjustment, which was an inflationary factor. So up until a certain point in time, and I can't remember if this is my question, we were giving pretty much automatic ECAs. They might have been like different valued, but it seemed like every year when I look at the data, there was one. And then at this point, we decided to take a look at more of the cost pressures for the ECA. Is that a fair analysis?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Summers, Matt Wilmar at LSO, between the 2001 and 2010 recalibrations, the legislature was still, and is still required to recognize inflationary adjustments in between years of recalibration. So there were external cost adjustments between the 2001 and 2005 recalibrations. Between the 2005 and 2010, there were also external cost adjustments. They weren't automatic. The legislature debated those and provided necessary adjustments that they felt were appropriate to the funding model. After the 2005 recalibration, there were substantial external cost adjustments for, I think, for the 3 school years preceding or 3 years after the 2005 recalibration. At that time, at the 2010 recalibration, the consultants estimated the legislature's funding levels exceeded their recommended levels by about $100 million. And so at that point, the ECAs between the 2005 and 2010 provided more funding. And part of that wasn't just the ECAs, but it was policy choices that the legislature adopted that were in excess of the consultant's recommendation. So while the ECAs do provide for those inflationary adjustments, some policy choices that between the legislature's funding model and what the consultants recommended provided that difference. So, but to be clear, the ECAs aren't automatic. They're a legislative policy decision that comes before this committee and the Joint Appropriations Committee in the interims of the legislature.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question, Matt. Was it during this time also that we broke the ECA into multiple parts to get a more clear look? It used to be one big number, and we would frankly look at 4 or 5 indexes, you know, a national one, a regional, a state. We'd actually pick the lowest one. You know, some were 4% inflation, others were 2%. We'd pick the lowest one. And then during this time, we settled on, hey, this is when we hired Dr. Taylor, I think, and others said, this is going to be the gauge. We're going to break it up into these 4 parts from, you know, energy or transportation. But can you just elaborate on that a little bit? Thank you.
You bet. Mr. Chairman and Representative Harshman, good question and good comments. You are correct. After the 2010 recalibration, the legislature became much more precise in the way it applied an external cost adjustment. Prior to then, it applied a single amount to all components of the funding model. After the 2010 recalibration, the legislature's consultants recommended a more precise discussion on which components to adjust. So they broke it into 4 components in your funding model: professional staff, which included teachers, administrators, folks that have to have some certification to do their work; non-professional staff, which would be your routine maintenance, secretarial and clerical staff; and then supplies and materials would be another category; and then the last category would be your utilities adjustment. Special education and transportation never received an external cost adjustment. Those are 100% reimbursed. So those aren't considered as part of your external cost adjustment discussions. But those 4 categories provide the legislature a much more targeted approach in applying inflationary pressures or accounting for inflationary pressures when those discussions occurred. And so since that time, the legislature has reviewed cost indices in response to those 4 areas to identify what those inflationary costs are.
Mr. Chairman, moving on from the 2010 recalibration to the 2015 recalibration. Again, that work was provided and I guess, assisted by Larry Pikus and his group of consultants. During that effort, they performed an in-depth review of salaries and the labor markets associated with the delivery of the K-12 education program. They also, to Representative Harshman's point, performed a review of the indices and process utilized in determining the necessity of an external cost adjustment, which I think you just referenced. In response to that, the legislature did not adopt legislation in coordination with that work, except for a couple of minor technical changes to part-time student attendance in a non-resident district and the computation of school district revenues to exclude tuition paid by one district to another. The 2017 recalibration was performed by a different consultant, APA, undertook that work, and in addition to reviewing the cost base, they also reviewed the educational programming across Wyoming, and also took a look at alternative recalibration approaches as well. Their effort, again, included interviews, stakeholder input, lots of listening sessions, online surveys, and expert content review of the educational program. As a result of that work, the legislature modified the basket of goods to include computer science and computational thinking, and it also modified the Hathaway scholarship requirements in that vein as well. The legislature enacted a number of technical changes as a result of that work, clarifying ADM and groundskeepers and special education model components. Your most recent recalibration, Representative Summers chaired it from the House side, and you undertook that in 2020. That was a continuation of the work from 2005, 2010, and 2015 that was performed by Pikus Auden and Associates. Again, there were not substantial changes made as a result by the legislature. I guess in closing, I would say the court did not dictate a specific process for recalibration, and in fact recognized that that should be a legislative function. So it's well within your purview to look at this issue and decide whether this is, the approach that you'd like to take or how you'd like to undertake that in the future. Subject to question. Mr. Chairman.
Brown. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This will probably be a question for the two of you together. Looking at this, my first blush at this was, we really haven't done a major revision. We've been pretty much staying the track for the past going on 11 years. Is that correct? We haven't made substantial changes. The one substantial change, I guess, let me rephrase that. The one substantial change that I can think of was in 2017, where there was a cut of, I think it was 36 million a year, $72 million biennium. And that was the legislative model discussion versus the consultant model discussion. Beyond that, we have really been riding the same train that has basically stayed the course. We have not made any major component changes to how we fund education. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Brown, I would say that's primarily accurate. Your 2005 recalibration was a substantial modification in your formula on funding K-12 education. Since that time, you've primarily adopted that same formula up to now. You've made some adjustments to the computation of average daily membership within the funding model. You've aligned the non-personnel items to the, I would say, to the cost-based levels, but in 2017, the legislature made some reductions in that area to reflect more precise levels to your recommended levels from your consultants. But for class sizes, the legislature has adopted a lower class size than has been recommended. But the inverse is also true. You fund fewer instruction facilitators, fewer resources for summer school and extended day, And so there are areas where the legislature has made policy choices that have differed from your consultants, but it's been primarily the same formula since 2005.
So thank you for that, Matt. My next question on that is, it might be beneficial for especially some of the newer members in regards to the external cost adjustments, that's not an every single year topic, and it's not brought forward to the committee every single year to discuss the inflationary increases in. So we do see it. Okay, I did not think that we saw it every single year, because the discussion that I've had with this, and I've been back and forth with this since 2017, is looking at how many external cost adjustments have not been granted on a yearly basis, on an annual basis, and how many have been implemented since 2010, I guess would be my direct question.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, I don't have those exact numbers off the top of my head on what ECAs have been adopted or not. What I can tell you from the most recent budget bill, or the budget bill that was adopted in the 2020 session, you provided an external cost adjustment on a temporary basis. And in fact, for this school year, that amount you provided for last school year was halved. And then it is gone after this school year. So it's a temporary external cost adjustment. And but that discussion comes before this committee every year in between a recalibration. So your recalibration years set kind of the base funding level for the school year after that recalibration effort. And then the years in between your recalibrations, that discussion comes before this committee. This committee makes a recommendation to the Joint Appropriations Committee, and then the Joint Appropriations Committee makes a recommendation to the governor and the legislature on its recommendation. So, and that's primarily set out in your statutes. 21-13-309 U is the controlling recommendation from this committee to the Joint Appropriations Committee. That's that monitoring report process Ms. Hytrek discussed. Then 21-13-309 O is your statute that discusses the external cost adjustment to your funding model, and that's the recommendation from the Joint Appropriations Committee.
It might be beneficial maybe for this committee moving forward to get some information if we could. It doesn't necessarily have to be today, but most definitely before the next committee, to maybe get an understanding of how many external cost adjustments have been granted and how many of them have been state implementation, how many have been halved, as we're doing with this one that disappear. So we can have a rough idea of what this committee has actually done for the cost of education moving forward. I'd like to see, if we're funding education, you know, we hear a lot about inflationary factors and that we have these automatic increases every single year. I'd like to see what that actually looks like compared to our external cost adjustments and whether or not we're keeping up with those inflationary adjustments.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, we will provide you a summary of the external cost adjustments. Again, I would remind the committee that the recalibrations kind of reset your base of what your consultants have recommended as the cost. Is kind of your estimation of what it costs to deliver. The legislature then at that point determines, you know, whether to adjust your funding model. And then after that recalibration year is when that discussion occurs. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, you know, try to look at this in 5-year chunks. And so, you know, when you see those ECAs from, you know, I think we have them back to the early 2000s. While they're cumulative up to the recalibration point, the legislature has the opportunity to recost that estimate or to recost its base level of funding for the recalibration. And so while the legislature hasn't really responded to these recalibrations since 2015, you know, that brings some discussion, I think, that you've heard in the past couple of years about ECAs coming on and off. And but we'll get you the information and provide that to you.
Mr. Chairman, I think the best probably be 2015 on, because I do agree. that we don't need to go back to 2010 looking at all this, but 2015 on, it's been a discussion. And that was the last time. That's why I started off my question with, that was really the last time that we made substantial changes to our funding model. And so it would be 2017, we did make changes, but we did not go through a full recalibration effort. The past two recalibration efforts that we've gone through did not end in legislation being passed. Therefore, we're still working on the same legislative model that we adopted in 2015, if I'm correct.
Let me ask a related question at this point. Am I right in thinking that the legislature has been funding with the model we've got now at a considerably higher level than what the consultants recommended? And that's true for this last time as well. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, up until this most recent recalibration, you as a legislature have funded at a level that has been higher than the recommended levels. This past recalibration was the first year where your consultants have recommended a higher level of funding than what is currently being resourced. And so to kind of give you a trajectory of since 2005, since we've tracked this in the 2010, as I mentioned earlier, 2010 recalibration, the consultants identified the legislative funding model exceeded its consultants' recommendations by about $103 million. In the 2015 recalibration, the consultants identified or estimated the legislative funding model exceeded its recommendations by approximately $41.5 million. In the 2017 recalibration with APA, Augenblick, Palak and Associates, they actually recommended $71.3 million more than what the legislature recommended. When you compare that to your PICUS and Auden recommendations from the 2015, it was about even, about $3 million. Your funding model is about $3 million higher than what the PICUS and Auden recommendations from the 2015 recalibration were. And then in your most recent recalibration last interim, PICUS, Auden and Associates recommended approximately 21 million more than what your legislative funding model is. So that was really your first year with PICUS, Auden and Associates, where your legislative funding model was lower than the consultant's recommendations. So now you're at this position where you've been advised in the most two recent recalibrations that your legislative funding levels are lower than consultant recommendations.
Representative Conlon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, welcome back, Ms. Hytrick. It's good to see you. Yay. I want to go back and talk a little bit more about the 2017 recalibration. That was one that we just started talking about, where the legislature decided that we wanted to take another look after 2015 with honestly the question of we've been using the same consultant for a decade or more. Let's take a different look with a different consultant. And we're also curious about how can other states pay less per ADM? It seemed to me that those were the questions. And would it be fair to say that the answers to those questions when we went into that 2017 recalibration was that the APA model, which was different than the PICUS and Auden model, came out to be slightly more money? And also the answer to the question of why are we paying more is simply that we are paying for the costs that are associated with education. The model in other states is the same. They simply are not paying for education the way that their models indicate that they should. And the reason is because our Constitution is so strong, and that Constitution has been operationalized by the Campbell decisions. Would that be a fair assessment of what happened in 17?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Connolly, in response to your constitutional statement, that certainly is the case. In Wyoming, education is a fundamental right, and in fact, they've said all other obligations of the state must fall to funding education.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Conley, to your other point on just the cost and why that was identified higher or why other states are lower on a per pupil basis than Wyoming. The APA approach, the PICA Sonata approach, and this gets into a little bit technical methodologies on consultants, but the PICA Sonata approach uses what they term as an evidence-based model approach, where they defer to research-based principles in their recommendations. The APA approach used primarily two approaches. One is called the successful schools and districts approach, and also the professional judgment approach. The professional judgment approach primarily adopts the evidence-based approach, but defers to educators and stakeholders on their recommendations on costs. And the successful schools and districts approach also primarily defers to what outperforming schools and districts are doing in their performance levels, and uses those expenditures and those theories in providing education to students, and using those levels for those costs. And so I think that was primarily one reason on the different approaches that the consultants took in identifying the cost is why APA came out a little bit higher, meaning they used actual teacher salaries that districts were paying as part of their recommendation to set the salary levels in their funding model. The PICA Sonata approach is taking a more market-based approach in identifying, that's where a lot of the cost of education is on teacher salaries or professional salaries within your model. And so that was one big divergence in kind of the cost of the two models or the two approaches is the methodology used in evaluating the cost for Wyoming. What other states are doing on their per pupil costs, Montana, Utah, Idaho, Colorado, they all have rural schools. And we, in our 2020 recalibration, evaluated the costs on a per pupil basis and broke it down by rural school districts. And while Wyoming is higher, other states have high per pupil costs in districts. But I don't know if that's answering your question or not, but I hope that provides some information.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, just a follow-up and a thank you for that. And then just the understanding that in 2017, the committee moved nothing forward, no bill, no recommendation. And there was the guidance that we were under no obligation to do so, and that the PICUS and Auden model, which was a lower dollar figure, was robust as well, and we could continue with that and meet our constitutional obligation. Would that be fair?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Connolly, in response to the first portion, you did adopt some technical school finance amendments, a clarification of ADM and a modification of the transportation, groundskeeper, and special education model components, but not wholesale changes. And actually, I think a number of people have referenced that fact, and recalibration is a process of recosting, but there's no obligation that the legislature adopt any modifications as a result of that.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Representative Connolly and I were both involved in that 2017 recalibration. And so the question, I think you kind of got to it, Matt, but not entirely on what my question is there, when we went into that recalibration effort, our idea was to examine what is the breadth of types of recalibration that we can do. So what are the different types? And so, as you said, there was the evidence-based, the successful school, the PJP, and I believe there was one other model. It had to do with statistical analysis, and I can't really remember. But my question to you, it seemed like during our investigation, there were really only 4 different models that you could really look at to do a school funding model. Is that accurate?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Summers, you are correct. In And the last model I did not mention was the statistical, or what they call statistical approach, or a cost function approach. And APA did explore that, and they actually hired a professor out of the University of San Diego, Dr. Amazeki, and she looked at Wyoming's data and essentially determined Wyoming's, and what it does is it utilizes assessment results from schools and districts and compares those to expenditures through an econometric analysis. Essentially, she determined Wyoming's data sampling size is too low to actually use that type of approach in Wyoming. So really, Wyoming has 3 opportunities to provide a school financing formula through the evidence-based model approach, the professional judgment approach, or the successful schools and districts approach.
And Mr. Chairman, so I kind of wanted to go over that with the committee and those people that are new. And really, I believe the reason at the time that we chose that, the APA, was we wanted to see the different look, right? We had been under Picus and Auden for a long time. APA was going to examine the statistical model as it went through. And so really the other 2 methodologies were what they created a model by. And certainly they did adjust salaries, but they also adjusted class size. So they did some stuff there. The other, I think one of the bigger things they did that was probably the most fair is we have a small school adjustment, and then, you know, we adjust in kind of in a stepped approach, and they adjusted in a curve-based approach, would put more money in the model, honestly. And so there were some of the reasons. But I think as we look at our recalibration and how we do recalibration, we examined in 2017 breadth of the models for a school funding model. You can choose whatever one you want, but that was, I think we looked at the breadth of the models.
A question on another vein, more along the methodology of approaching things. The last recalibration was done by was it a select committee? It wasn't done by the regular education committee. And the result was you got the bill in the session, was introduced in the House, and they passed out a substitute bill, did you not? The Senate went and did its own bill, and then we wound up using the House bill as a vehicle, and couldn't come to agreement in the conference. But it would seem from the evidence of that particular thing that the approach of using a special or select committee is fraught with the education committee wasn't adequately involved in the thing and promptly went to different approaches when we got in session. Was that true of the 2015 or 2017 efforts, or were those done by the Joint Interim Committee? I frankly don't remember.
Mr. Chairman, all of the recalibrations, with the exception of the 2001 recalibration, were conducted by a select committee.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, I think in a, oops, feedback. I think, and this is and certainly Representative Harshman and Representative Connolly have, you know, far longer background on this than me. But I think what I saw in 15 and I think what happened before is it was always a meld of education and approach and leadership. It has been that over time. The money people, the education people, and then the leadership. That's kind of been the makeup of that committee over time.
But when you get a situation where you get in session, and the first thing the committee that has the official recalibration bill does is a substitute bill, makes me wonder about the approach of that, of using a select committee on that as opposed to using an interim
Mr. Chairman, one final thought as well on that topic is I do believe the Joint Education Committee members were invited to the work of the select committee over the course of the interims. So. No, Mr. Chairman, I believe that concludes this topic, subject to questions.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I've asked Mr. Wilmarth to kind of bring out, there's an old graph that shows and I think it's another important thing for the new members to realize is the legislative model and the consultants model are not the same, and they vary on class size, they vary on activities, they vary on a variety of, for example, small school adjustment, small district adjustment, were all concepts of the legislature and not the consultants. And so I think we have these two models that kind of ride by each other. And so what I've asked Mr. Wilmarth, and there's a really great chart that shows we used to have the legislative model quite a ways above the consultants model. And now, now we've converged and even crossed. And I think that graph is a good depiction and should be handed out, sent out to the whole committee. I think it's informative.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, to that point, within the previous monitoring reports, and that's under that 2113-309U, your LSO is charged with putting together a series of information on the cost indices on recommendation of inflation. Prior to the 2020 recalibration, we've monitored your evidence-based model recommendations compared to your legislative model to give you an illustration of what those recommended costs are compared to your legislative model. And so comparing the consultant's recommendations to the legislative model provided some guidance on whether or not you exceeded the total cost of education as recommended by your consultants compared to what you're funding. Part of that analysis, though, is as Representative Summers indicated, I mean, those are just based upon the policy choices of the legislature. The differences are primarily related to the policy choice of legislature. And like I said, it goes both ways, whether you have lower class sizes than recommended by your consultants or fewer instruction facilitators or summer school and extended day resources than recommended by your consultants. It even gets more detailed on by district. And so districts are winners and losers under both models. And so it can get very granular and can kind of, it influences your perspective on whether that total cost of education is just a statewide issue or some district or some policymakers focus on their own individual district. And so, when we look at that in terms of inflation, I'm not sure going forward how useful that is. Your chosen methodology for your funding model should be really your primary charge in adjusting that legislative funding model for inflationary purposes. And I think that's really what the court speaks to is, they're not dictating what consultant to choose and what recalibration methodology to choose, but whatever legislative model you do choose, you need to account for inflation in between years of recalibrations. And so while it is informative, that historical graph, all it does is really reflects the policy choices that the legislature has made. But when we get to terms of inflationary discussions, the legislature is then charged with inflation, its chosen methodology for inflationary purposes. And so, like I said, that cost difference is just not related to inflation. It's a whole host of policy choices that the legislature has made over the course of the past 16 years. And so I leave you with that. And I'll certainly send you a link to our 2019 monitoring report that tracks But going forward, I'd like to get some feedback whether or not that's even useful going forward. I'm not sure that it is, because each recalibration identifies a new cost based upon those policy choices or recommendations from your consultants. Your charge in between recalibrations is to account for inflation. And so we'd like to hear some feedback on that going forward.
That brings up a question. Mr. Wilmarth, let me ask about that. In the past, we've turned some cost adjustment things down on the grounds that we were basically overfunded with the legislative model, and we didn't need them for that reason. As we go forward, now it's going to be complicated by the federal funds and federal restrictions, if presuming we accept the federal funds. We'll get to that later in the day. But going forward, it would seem to me the issue then becomes, do we feel that what we've got is adequately fully reflecting the cost of education? Or if we feel that there've been some excesses creep in that are causing spending over and above the true cost of education, then one way of getting at that is by not proceeding with external cost adjustments for a while. Is that not, what am I missing in that?
Mr. Chairman, I think in the past that's been part of the argument, is that, at the 2010 recalibration, your legislative funding model exceeded your consultant's recommendations by $100 million. But now we're in a position after the 2020 recalibration, your legislative funding model is approximately $20 million less than what your consultants recommended. Again, this gets complicated in that those aren't reflective of inflation. It's policy choices of certain components within your funding model. And so the year is in between recalibration. Again, I believe are to account for inflationary pressures or costs on your legislative funding model. And so you're now put into a position where if you're looking at, even within the $20 million, it varies by school district, whether you're higher than what the consultants recommend or lower. And again, those are based upon the components' policy choices. I hope that helps. I don't know if it does.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And seeing as how we're exploring the ECA as in relationship to the legislative model, one of the things that I think about is the legislative model is not simply more money. The legislative model is about something that we in the legislature have deemed to be of greater value, honestly, than consultants. And the biggie, I think, is that we deem lower class sizes in the lower levels makes more sense for us, and we'd like to see that. And therefore, we put more money in the model for districts to be able to implement that. But the reality is that we give districts a block grant, and they can do with it what they want. But going back to that, the legislative model really is about additional funding for something that we value. So when we do that, and then the block grant becomes higher than the evidence-based model, the consultant's model, and we don't give an ECA, we still expect that the districts are doing what the legislature told them to do, by decreasing class size at the lower level. So what that would mean is that there would be more personnel, for example. If that happened, that's what it means. When we don't give an ECA, it means that the people who've been employed are not getting an additional inflation-based adjustment. To me, it means that we're not really giving an ECA to individuals, but what we're simply doing is we are bringing the block grant closer to what the evidence-based model, the consultant's model is. Is that another way to think about the ECA?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Conley, I don't think so. Because I think your consultants would also adjust their model by an inflationary factor as well. And they've recommended that, you know, inflation occurs whether you're looking at their model or the legislative model. If you're gonna align yourself, the ECA is not to align yourself closer to your evidence-based model recommendations. And that, maybe I'm misinterpreting the question.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, I think I wasn't clear enough. That I'm concerned that the direction that we're going in is thinking about the ECA in terms of relationship to the evidence-based model. And a determination, if we go back to Representative Brown's kind of question and wanting information from 2015, that sometimes we haven't given an ECA because we don't need to in order to meet the consultant's recommendation in an evidence-based model. The reality is, though, I think that by not giving an ECA for districts that are actually following the legislative model, we are not, in fact, doing an inflation adjustment.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Conley, correct. So I think between 2010 and I'll say the 2020 recalibrations, I think you've been provided advice that your total cost through your legislative model has exceeded your consultant's recommendations, excluding the EPA recommendation, your PICUS and audit and evidence-based model recommendations. And you potentially, not potentially, but you received advice that your total cost of education has exceeded those evidence-based model recommendations, and you may not have to provide an ECA. You may not have to. I think that's an argument that I think there's arguments on both sides. I'll just leave it at that.
Leave it at that, or we'll be debating it all morning. Because I think that's going to come up again as we look at the degree of departure there is in the several school districts from the models anyhow. And that when we get talking about ECA, the question would be, is it really justified, or is there sufficient room within what's going on to accommodate the very real inflationary effects we're starting to get? And at some point, the inflation will overwhelm what we can accommodate, but we're a ways from that. And you've got the additional complications of the federal restrictions. So we'll have to deal with that later on. Let me ask a very different kind of question. We didn't pass legislation as a result of the last ECA passed recalibration. We passed some legislation in 2017, but not a full one. I don't detect any enthusiasm in the legislature for doing another recalibration attempt. When are we next obliged to do one?
Mr. Chairman, you're required to perform a recalibration not less than once every 5 years. So your last recalibration was in 2020, so 2025 would be your next obligation.
Okay.
And
So we're fine on the legalities there.
as far as complying with that particular statutory provision, correct. And in response to Representative Connolly's point about the ECA, you will receive your reports in October, and you'll be able to discuss that in a very robust manner at that point.
Yes, I think we can anticipate. I think I detect differences within the committee. I think we will have a very robust discussion at that point. And I don't know how it will play out in the legislature as a whole. Okay. If there's nothing further on this, we'll proceed next to the fiscal analysis memorandum. Now, let me ask you, because I will get it wrong, sure as all get out. How do you pronounce your name?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Leanne Hogue.
Leanne Hogue.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And correct me if I get it wrong. I tend to get those things wrong, and I apologize in advance. But do correct me if I do get it wrong, okay? Okay, go ahead and proceed.
Mr. Chairman, good morning, members of the committee. Leanne Hogue, LSO. Before you, there should be a memo titled K-12 School Operations and Construction Funding and Historical Revenues and Appropriations. This memo serves as background on K-12 operations and capital construction and is part of your interim topic number 2, K-12 education program and school finance. To begin, this memo provides an update on the projected shortfall for both operations and capital construction. It's important to note that these shortfall projections are based on the January 2021 CRAG, and with how revenues are currently pacing, these projections will be changing in the October report. So on page 2 of your memo, you will see 2 tables, table 1 and table 2. And they serve as a summary of the long-term forecast. So going out into the 2025-26 biennium. Table 1 highlights the estimated shortfall in the school foundation program account, which is your main account for school operations. Currently, based on the January 2021 CRAG report, for the 21-22 biennia, there is an estimated shortfall of $331 million. The 23-24 biennia, an estimated shortfall of $459 million. And for the 25-26 biennia, $535 million. This analysis, as I mentioned before, is limited. We do know that the Common School Permanent Land Fund spending policy has reached that full 5% for fiscal year 2021. We also know that energy prices are pacing ahead of the January 2021 CRAG report. So this will be updated in October.
Ask several questions, and I think the committee may have some other questions. Go back to page 1 of the memorandum. The operations funding assumptions. You have an annual 4% growth for reimbursements starting in 2022. My notes are which reimbursements for what? What are you talking about when you say reimbursements?
Mr. Chairman, when we discuss,
Mike.
when we discuss reimbursements, we're primarily discussing special education and transportation, but there's other various reimbursements for out-of-state tuition. There's an in-state tuition agreement with Fremont County School District number 38. And there's a small reimbursement for teacher extra compensation reimbursements. And cooperative service agreements amongst school districts. So there's, but the primarily 2 largest reimbursement categories are your special education funding and transportation. As I mentioned earlier, those are not subject to your ECA discussions. And so we assume, based upon historical trends, 4% increases on an annual basis.
Can cover a wide multitude of things, and I wasn't at all clear what you were talking about there. Okay, So- Along that line, you're talking on the capital construction funding assignments, the first bullet point, 842247 reduction. What reduction where? What are you talking about there?
Mr. Chairman, so in the last session, there was a reduction for the state construction department in that school facilities commission operations budget.
This is the operating budget of the schools.
Correct.
Okay. On the last line, capital constructions are estimated at 70 million for FY 2023, 2024. My question there is that 70 million in each of those 2 years or 70 million in the combined by?
Mr. Chairman, that's 70 million in the combined.
Need microphone systems. Wow. On your table 1, you say the $131 million for the current biennium. Has that already occurred?
Mr. Chairman, no, that has not occurred.
But you anticipate that it will?
Correct.
Okay. And then the LSRA transfer is 459 in 23-24. Am I right in thinking that the difference there is that there is for the current biennium, there was a beginning balance of 232.4 in the school foundation program and a projected ending balance at the standard 100 million. And that's why the LSRA transfer is not substantially the same between those two biennia. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
Okay, so the next line confuses me. Shortfall, I didn't understand what that 198 figure is. Because it seems to me the total shortfall is the sum of the drawdown on school foundation and the transfer. And going forward, it's simply the transfer. So that I did not understand that 198. Could you, what am I missing?
Mr. Chairman, so that 198 figure is essentially what the shortfall would be without the transfer. So without the transfer from the LSRA.
I'm having difficulty with that. Maybe somebody could help me with that one, because it seems to me that the transfer without the LSRA transfer, the shortfall would be the sum of the decline in the school foundation balance, which I think is 132.4 plus the 331. And that would give you the total that we were short in terms of our current inflows. Am I right? What am I missing here? Representative Overman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look at it the same way you do, Mr. Chairman. There's two components to the shortfall. You look at the right under the K-12 operation shortfall last, for the first sentence at the very end says shortfall is 331. So that's sort of the starting point. Then you go down to the estimated shortfall in the table and it says 1. So you have that inconsistency. The inconsistency is because the 132 of the drawdown of the beginning balance has been netted against the 331 to create this 198 number, which is really a netting of the LSRA drawdown and the drawdown of the beginning balance. So I see your analysis, the chairman's analysis is correct that there's two sources of shortfall for this biennium, the drawdown of the beginning balance plus the draw on the LSRA. And if you look at the logic of that would be, if you look at 23-24, you see that basically based on modeling that's very similar to 21-22, the deficit is 459. So if you use that same logic in 21 and 22, the deficit is 463.4. So that's the way I look at it, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And, during session, we kind of got together with Fiscal and wanted to understand what was the structural shortfall in education. And it really, the numbers came out to be about 250 on the operation side, which would be about 500 a biennium, and 50 million on the Capcom side a year. And so, you can kind of see that, in the 459 because that's pretty close to 500. And so I wonder about that 198.6 number myself, whether it's really reflective of what we would call a shortfall. And so, thank you.
Yeah. To relabel this or something. I understand the math of what's going on, but I don't think the logic is the way we're likely to think about it. So maybe we're going to need to make a correction in the presentation here as to how that's done. Am I right in thinking, though, that what this enables us to do is look forward and say, at what point are we going to get in trouble if we continue down the current path that we're on? And then the LSRA drawdown figures are what really counts, are they not? And so the LSRA is now what? Start of this biennium was 1.5 billion, roughly, am I right? And we're then taking it down by 331 plus 459 on these projections, which is about 890 millions of dollars, right? And so we'll still be able to cover. But when we get into 25, 26, then we promptly run out of the LSRA, presuming we're going to keep a minimum balance of 500 million to cover we've got other things we do, all kinds of draws. And so I presume that the fact they're showing no LSRA transfer in 2025 is that you'll think we'll hit that and we'll cease having that available. And so the projection then is that at that point, as the saying goes, we fall over the cliff. Is that a correct analysis of what this is showing?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, we're just using these estimated long-term scenarios to identify potentially when the LSRA will no longer buttress your school foundation program account. As you correctly pointed out, the law currently indicates or states that the LSRA no longer will provide a minimum of $100 million each fiscal year to the school foundation program account when the LSRA balance hits $500 million. And so based upon the assumptions laid out on page 1 and the January 2021 Craig forecast, that's what this table represents, is what those estimated drawdowns on the LSRA will be for the school foundation program account. To get you to the 198 number, I'll try to explain how that logic is provided. We assume that you will use the cash balance above $100 million. So the $132 million is an available balance to the legislature, whether within the school foundation program account. We don't look at that as a structural, on that last row, we don't look at that as a structural issue. What we're doing is subtracting the 132 as part of the beginning balance and subtracting that from the LSRA transfer, because we're only required to restore up to the $100 million.
And I think we understand that. Now, let me take this one step further. We are facing, as a state right now, as much uncertainty as I've ever seen in terms of what our mineral revenue is going to be. On the one hand, price of oil is going up. The price of coal has come down. I think natural gas has been relatively stable, has it not? Is it starting? Is it started to creep up a bit too? And so you have that on the positive side. Normally that would mean we look forward to, gee, we're going to be back in the flush times. But at the same time, you have the Biden administration's efforts to choke off drilling and fracking on federal minerals. And most of Wyoming's minerals, particularly where you're producing with large horizontal drillings, you're very likely to go through federal land in the process. So I've talked to a number of the people in the oil business who told me you just can't drill in Wyoming right now as a practical matter. It's because the federal uncertainties and restrictions, and with the production coming so much from fracking, that falls off quite rapidly after the completion of a well, and you use it for a year, so you get a tremendous amount of the production in the first year, and much smaller in the second years. I think we've got some experts. I think I see two of them sitting together on the committee on what goes on in that. So there's been an injunction from a judge in Louisiana against some of the restrictions. I don't think we know how that's going to play out yet. I see us as facing just a tremendous amount of uncertainty as to whether we're going to be able to keep our production up at a level that really enables us to take much advantage of the higher prices. Senator Beitman or Senator Ruffus, two of you want to add anything to that? Am I right in thinking there's a lot of uncertainty here?
Mr. Chairman, there's always a lot of uncertainty in oil prices and oil production. The two obviously affect each other, and we tend to be subject to the whims of international oil production to determine the prices. I know that there's a lot of that up in the air right now. We're fortunate that production is strong and the pricing is strong. Hopefully that continues for a while. Let Senator Beitman add it.
I would just add that, as I work in the oil industry, on the exploration side, even with the higher oil prices, there has been not the corresponding increase in new exploration activity in Wyoming. I haven't seen it. That's alarming because you need that new exploration, the new leasing to provide you that production in 5 years. So looking out 5 years, if things don't pick up, we're gonna be in trouble.
Yeah, I would add to that. I happened to go to a function the local oil people up in Casper put on, talked to one of the senior oilmen in the state, who was he said, we just can't drill in Wyoming right now. And that was May. And that, I found that to be just very frightening. To bring it back to this, what I would say is what I've done, and I want to ask both the staff and the committee whether I'm wildly off base. I'm talking to people. I'm saying that we are drawing down the reserves. We may get in trouble where we've run out of them in 4 years, or it may be 3 years, or it may be 5 years, depending on how this mineral pricing versus mineral production all works out, and we're just uncertain. Senator Ruffus?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to follow up on one point, which gets to some of the underlying calculations in table 1 and ask a couple of questions about calculation with regard to the spending policy amount associated with the Common School Permanent Land Fund. And it's my expectation, although I didn't see the calculations here, that when this was put forward, it assumes the current asset value of the Common School Permanent Land Fund reserve account, and then does not fill that and only uses a 2.1% revenue off of the value of the account moving forward. So the first thing that would happen then is it would try and meet the 5% spending policy amount until it burns through the current reserve account. Following that, it would only reflect a 2.1% yield rather than the full 5% spending policy amount. And that difference is about $150 million a year. Is all that accurate in how the calculations were done?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Rothfuss, it's a biennial number instead of an annual number.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, if you look on the goldenrod, bottom of page 5, the Common School Permanent Land Reserve account, I believe there's a projected $150 million transfer from the reserve account to the School Foundation Program account, guaranteeing the 5% spending policy amount. So for fiscal year 2021, since the Common School account achieved its full 5%, that guarantee of the spending policy will not occur through the Common School Reserve account. So that money will then be able to utilize for the full guarantee through the 25-26 biennium. So when we come back in October, you'll notice the revenue from that source of funding will be higher than what these projections show. But through the 23-24, and I also think through the 25 fiscal year, the full 5% is guaranteed regardless if it's through actual investment income or through the Common School Reserve account. But the projection on the guarantee, the additional 2.9%, comes from that spending policy reserve account. And I believe for this current biennium, it's about 150 million.
So then when we look at these numbers, if the spending policy amount were to be fully realized through the investment income, realistically, the LISRA would then be around 300 million stronger, theoretically, because you've got two taps from it of about 150 million each. Is that fair back of the envelope calculation?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Office, the investment income from the Common School account does not impact the transfer of my LSRA until the 25-26 biennium, because under the current long-term profile, the 5% is guaranteed through the spending policy reserve account. What actual investment income earnings are based upon the meeting the 5% spending policy through actual investment income will allow the reserve account to guarantee further on. So without tapping the reserve account, will allow you to, in the 25-26 biennium, potentially utilize the LSRA further.
Gotcha. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I see what you're saying. So we have sufficient in the reserve to meet the need in 23-24. It's not until 25-26 that the reserve would fail, and the additional revenue would potentially be available to fill that reserve.
Mr. Chairman, Center Office, that's correct.
I understand. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to follow up on that, I think, so back to page 1 of this, and you can see the operations funding assumptions. And, you know, as you go down those assumptions, you know, the biggest driver obviously is the number of customers. We've had growth that's maybe plateaued off. We don't know, but I think we're going to know more with COVID and folks who are moving to our state. Then the annual 6% health insurance, really good news on that. Obviously, it's going to probably be 0 this year, maybe even a rebate back, but look for that to probably kick up. I think the change where we went to the 85-15 to 82-17, I don't know, is a big part in the COVID treatments that were put off has helped that. And then my next question on the growth of reimbursements, you mentioned several, but aren't SPED and transportation about 99% of the reimbursements? I mean, the rest of that stuff's so small to pay one kid's tuition in Park County who goes to Montana. So that's about 99% special ed and transportation. So then when you flip over, Mr. Chairman, and I think it's important when you go to the K-12 operations shortfall, and if you go about to line 4, and it says table 1 summary, however, is of limited value at this time. And I think it's really important. Most of us, our mindsets are back on the May 20 Craig. And, you know, my former job as speaker, I was actually kind of in favor of that at the time, because we were trying to think, if we have to cut budgets, we want to get out in front of this in July. So we have 24 months to cut budgets. There were others, some sitting here said, why don't we wait till October? Things will settle out. We went ahead with that May Craig. I think it scared everybody. The thing about fear, it's like faith, you know, they both believe in the future. And I think we were operating by a little bit of fear. Things changed by October dramatically, and then January, and now they've changed even more dramatically. And so I think the other part of this, I want to talk about what the spending policy amounts. We really passed a good bill, Senate file on returning these spending policies to 5%. But I think as you look at those biennials under 21, 22, 23, 24, what Senator Rothfuss said is really important, because we only profile dividends and interest, and that's about 2.14%. So the other 5% then is profiled out of the reserve account. The reserve account only lasts 3 years. And so when you look at 21, 22, looks great. 23, 24, now you can't see it in there, but in 24 now you're starting to pull, you don't have a reserve account to guarantee the 5%. And so that's where the LSRA draw will become a little bigger. And then it also shows that the LSRA doesn't get refueled, because that's not guaranteed. That's not part of that 2.1%, because the reserve runs out on the permanent side as well. That's about $100 million a year refuel. 1.25% of the 8 billion is 100 million refill of the LSRA. We know that's going to happen. It's going to happen in the next few weeks. And so when you look at the May to May LSRA. Last May, it was 1.467 billion. This May, it's 1.384, and we know it's going to get refueled another 100. We're going to grow the LSRA in the last year, and we're going to keep growing. And then, so the big part of that, then the third part where investment income, the good news, first of all, I'm going to defend the legislature a little bit. We've been labeled to do nothing in the legislature, but legislatures work in increments, and we've done a lot of good increments. We've done the state mineral royalties. We've done this investment income. It's huge. And you'll see this later on in this report, how school CapCon has shifted from COLI's bonus to really investment returns. And so you're going to, the problem with going into 24, 25, 26 is there's no LSRA refuel. There's no SIPA, which half of it goes to school CapCon, 45%. And there's no common school count refuel. And that's where you see all that whammy start to happen in 25, 26. So 25, 26 is going to happen. But I think let's don't operate out of fear. And it's going to, you know, there's been tougher times in our state's history, and we're going to work through this. But I would tell people and the executive branch and others, we're going to work in real slow increments. And we're going to keep doing little nuggets. And we'll eventually keep working towards that solution. And that's why we keep meeting every year. You're never totally done. But this investment piece really is about, it's basically 100 million on the LSRA, 100 million on the school side operations, and about 50 million on school CapCon. So about $250 million that falls off the map here after 3 years. That's the part I think you got to realize that's really important to this. And finally, Mr. Chairman, we all worked off of our LSO numbers at 300 million a year structural deficit, 250 and 50, which was stated earlier. And I'm not sure everybody saw when we left town, but that dropped to 270. And part of it was passage of Senate File 60. But so that's down to 270 now for both those accounts, and it's dropped dramatically. Natural gas prices. A hot summer is tremendous for Wyoming. And so that's going to be really an important part. And as you know, Mr. Chairman, we're like every other state. We fund our schools with property taxes primarily. And the issue in Wyoming is that minerals pay most of the property taxes, and those go up and down. And then the other big driver for Wyoming, of course, is federal mineral royalties. But the investment income is a big part, and that's going to continue, and we'll keep moving this forward, but it'll work out. We're still going to have schools in 25, 26 and beyond. And so we'll just keep working at this. But the investment income is about $250 million a year, falls off in 3 years. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I will make one comment on that. And that is the reason we don't profile the investment income till we get it is that some years we don't get it. And particularly with the market at its very high levels right now, I do think you've got to recognize that there is a possibility that one of these future years, that part of the investment income is going to be negative. And that then, as I understand our system, that negative has to be filled up before we start recognizing investment income from capital gains. So there's an uncertainty in there, and that's why it isn't profiled. There's a big uncertainty because it happens about, I think historically, about 2 years in town.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just, and I agree 100%. I am not advocating. I've won that battle on the floor of the House. I think I'm 13-0 on and profiling capital gains. We do not want to get into that. But 7 out of 10 years, we make spending policy throughout our history. And that's why we have a reserve account. And I think your CapFin group is working to make this even more stable and more of an endowment model like Utah and other states have done. So the work is continuing in increments as we move forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And you know, I want to go back to during session, based on the January Craig, we asked Fiscal Shop, what is our structural shortfall? And it was the 250 operations 50. And that included the fact, and this is my question to you two. I believe that included the fact that we were projecting that we were going to meet our spending policy going forward. So I think is that correct? First of all, and then I'll finish my statement.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers, we guaranteed it for as long as the reserve account could. And so in the first two biennia that you see on here, yes, the 5% spending policy from the common school account was achieved through a guarantee from the reserve account.
And so, Mr. Chairman, that number that was given to us in session, 250 million a year on the operations side, 50 million on the CapCon side, that is our structural deficit. There is no question that's going to move to the positive. In other words, we're going to reduce that structural deficit with an upcoming Craig. But we also have to recognize that as it was mentioned, as much of this money is in property taxes, which is going to be out another 18 months. So it's going to be some of the catch up in the Craig will be out quite a ways. But I think if we keep our eye on that ball, 250 and 50, recognize that we have a shortfall, that we should work on this over time. And I agree, we don't need to solve it all at once, but we need to incrementally solve this shortfall so we don't run over a cliff at some point in time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Clarification,
Yeah.
and then I've been ignoring Representative Obermueller, and I know I need to get back to it.
Sorry, just on Representative Summers' question with the 250/50, that 250 as kind of the ballpark shortfall per year, that would be excluding the 3% of the 5% capital gains for the SPA per year, as I understand it, based on those calculations, or including? You would think that's including, so 250 would assume that we have a full spending policy amount moving forward.
Mr. Chairman and Center Office, until the 25-26 biennium, as you can see, the estimated shortfall increases from 459 million to 535 million. Part of that reason is the spending policy is no longer guaranteed. Okay. And I will complicate this answer or response to one of the statements Representative Summers made. While we are enjoying a higher production and higher price level on commodities, on minerals this calendar year, it is much more complex now with the monthly ad valorem bill that was passed during the 2021 session. This calendar year will not be paid in 18 months unless a company receives an exemption from their county commissioners. Under the monthly ad valorem bill, the mineral ad valorem taxes will be paid over a 14-year period between 2020, I think December of 2023 or 2022 through 2035. And so while we are enjoying a robust production and pricing environment as compared to the January Craig, that bill will not work like it historically, or that those revenues will not be enjoyed 18 months from now like they historically done, unless the county commissioners approve an exemption to that payment schedule. I won't get into the details. You have other committees that are addressing some of those topics, but I just wanted to remind the committee that this mineral pricing environment and production environment does not necessarily result in higher or lower projections in our shortfalls due to the full mineral revenue coming in from that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question back on the tables and a little clarification on the limitations of this particular schedule that has a limited value at this time. And I'm So I'm questioning about the fact that it has limited value. So when we move to October, based on the assumptions that we know today, what does this table look like in October based on our present assumptions?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Obermueller, a couple comments there. I think somebody has their mic on. Thank you. We will, I think there's 3 areas that we'll update in October. The first will be your federal minimum royalties that are directed towards the school foundation program account. Those are currently pacing about $30 million higher for fiscal year 21 than the year January Craig projection. So you can see a reduction in your 21-22 shortfall by about 30 million attributable to federal minimum royalties. As discussed earlier, you won't see it in your 21-22 column, but your 25-26 column, since your common school account achieved its spending policy of 5% of the 5-year market average. That additional guarantee, about $75 million that would have been guaranteed from your reserve account to your school foundation program account, will occur on the back end. So since that transfer will not occur in fiscal year 21, we potentially can guarantee further out in your 25-26 biennium. So that's one update that you'll see in October, Craig, is that the common school reserve account, the spending policy reserve account, will be able to guarantee further out than what we anticipated in the January and April update from the end of session. And then finally, we'll be able to account for those pricing and production updates that the consensus revenue estimating group comes back with on assessed valuation property taxes. I hope that helps.
Oh, Mr. Chairman. So based on what we know now, you've talked us down from a $463 million deficit to a $430 million deficit, with the rest of the good news simply being a building up of future reserve accounts, the way I understand it, into the 25-26 biennium. So I don't see that anything happening now, what you told me, really changes the picture for what we're looking at currently in terms of deficits. And one follow-up here, once 25-26 is adjusted, will it look similar to 23-24, which is fully funded at a 5% spending policy? It says $459 million shortfall. Will 25-26 look similar to that once the fully funding mechanism kicks in?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Obermueller, I'll take your last question first. I think, yes, we can guarantee the investment income potentially in another year due to the fact that we hit the spending policy in fiscal year 21. I do think the bigger picture, though, is you still have a structural issue within your school foundation program account. The updates that will come in October don't reconcile the huge structural issues that you have. There will be potentially lower transfers from the LSRA, so you can potentially not hit that $500 million mark in the 25-26 biennium. So you may be able to guarantee some amount from the LSRA to the school foundation program account, but there's still a structural issue within your school foundation program account.
Thank you. One follow-up, Mr. Chairman. Just to point out, we haven't looked at table 2, but it has the same calculation issues there. It looks like if you combine the two numbers, the transfers of 73 million plus the drawdown at the beginning of the account, the actual deficit for 21-22 is 94.8. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, with your blessing, we can move to table 2. So, Mr. Chairman, looking at table 2, this is the estimated capital construction shortfall. As Representative Obermueller stated, a little bit different way of looking at the 21-22 biennium. Essentially, what that 51.6 number is we're assuming, like Matt said prior, that the 21.6 will be spent in operations, and the 73.2 transfers will cover to bring that beginning balance for the 23-24 biennium to 0. So the 51.6 is the estimated shortfall based on the assumptions of what would be spent out of for capital construction minus what transfers school capital construction would receive. So for the fiscal year 21-22 biennium, there is not a shortfall currently. For the 23-24 biennium, the estimated shortfall is $76 million. And then for the 25-26 biennium, this is a cumulative $244 million shortfall. So it's the carryover of the $76 million shortfall plus an additional $168 million shortfall for the 25-26 biennium.
Let me stop you right there and ask you, so there's a growth from 76 million to what, 168 million between the two biennia? What explains that? Why? What's going on?
Mr. Chairman, that is pretty much attributable to the spending policy. Yeah, so for school capital construction, and we'll kind of get to this a little bit later, the school major maintenance subaccount within the SIPA is underneath the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund spending policy. And for the 25-26 biennium, it's estimated that we won't reach that. So the 45% will no longer go towards school capital construction.
I will say I didn't understand the answer.
So, Mr. Chairman, it's similar to your school foundation program account. Your Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund reserve account guarantees the full spending policy to the SIPA, which is about 1.25% of the 5-year market average. In the 25-26 biennium, the long-term profile no longer guarantees that revenue stream because it's assumed the reserve account, the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust reserve account, can no longer guarantee that spending policy amount because it's exhausted in the earlier bienniums. And so that amount is about $90 million a biennium. And so that's why that structural shortfall of that moves from 76 to 168 million. And that's primarily that $90 million that is no longer guaranteed through your reserve account on the PMTF side. Oh, hope that helps.
Mr. Chairman, this memo also provides, if there's no questions on the shortfall, this memo also provides an overview of the funding account structure for all of K-12 finance. And so in an effort to better understand this, I'll move into the 9 accounts that support K-12 finance, and those are listed on page 3. The common school account within the permanent land fund, Common School Land Income Account, the Common School Permanent Land Fund Spending Policy Reserve Account, the School Foundation Program Account, the School Foundation Program Reserve Account, the School Lands Mineral Royalties Account, the School Major Maintenance Subaccount within the Strategic Investments and Projects Account, the School Capital Construction Account, and the Legislative Stabilization Reserve Account. And so on page 4, Figure 1 shows a flow chart of how these accounts interact with each other. and I will go ahead and explain these individual accounts as they come. So first off, we'll look at the accounts that are K-12 operations accounts. And the first account we'll look into is the common school account within the permanent land fund. The permanent land fund was created to hold proceeds from lands awarded by the Act of Admission. And Wyoming Statute 94310, paragraph A, established 12 funds within the permanent land fund, one of which, and the largest being the common school permanent land fund. The Wyoming Constitution requires that these funds be used for the exclusive benefit of public schools. These funds are invested by the state treasurer, and the best investment income is directed into the permanent land fund income fund, which is the common school land income account. The legislature has also adopted spending policies for the investment earnings of the common school permanent land fund, which can be found at the back of this memo in attachment A. That is the flow chart of how the spending policy currently sits for fiscal year 2021. Moving on, the spending policy directs investment earnings to the SFP and is guaranteed by the Common School Permanent Land Fund Reserve Account and is backed by an FMR fund swap between the SFP and the reserve account. Figure 2 on page 6 identifies the historical revenues of the Common School Permanent Land Fund from fiscal year 2005-2006 biennia to fiscal year 2019-2020. You can see that that's land income, spending policy deposits, sales and purchases of land, direct appropriations, and then gains and loss adjustments. Moving to the Common School Land Income Account. This account receives revenues from investment income off of the Common School Permanent Land Fund, and it also receives revenues from leases and bonuses, which are the non-depletable activities on the Common School Permanent Land Fund lands. Figure 3 on page 7 identifies the historic revenues for this Common School Land Income account. The School Foundation Program Reserve Account was created in 2014 and codified in 2015 by creating Wyoming Statute 2113-306.1. This account initially received appropriations from the SIPA account and the general fund. And for the 21-22 biennia, it is set to receive any COLIS bonuses that would have technically historically gone to the school capital construction account. The reserve account can also receive severance taxes if certain conditions are met.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question on your, on this common school account. We passed the Senate File 121, I think, which takes the statutory 1% severance for 8 years now. We're going to direct that to the common school account because we know that percentage of severance is derived off school lands. And is that in your kind of projections to the growth of the corpus or not? I don't want to get in the weeds on this, but simple no. Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, moving on, the next account is the Common School Permanent Land Fund Spending Policy Reserve Account. And this was established by Wyoming Statute 94719, paragraph F, to help deposit funds into the Common School Permanent Land Fund. In the years where 150% of the Common School Permanent Land Fund spending policy is exceeded, that excess amount is directed to the Common School Permanent Land Fund. The Common School Permanent Land Fund Reserve Account also receives revenues from FMRs from the fund swap with the SFP. Figure 4 on page 8 identifies historic revenues directed to the Common School Permanent Land Fund Reserve Account. The School Foundation Program account is the main operations account for school finance, and it receives revenues from the 12 mil state levy or ad valorem taxes, FMRs, district recapture payments, common school land income, automobile taxes, and other smaller sources. The SFP and districts rely heavily, as mentioned earlier, on the mineral industry due to the collection of ad valorem taxes and FMRs. Figure 5 on page 9 identifies historic and estimated revenues to the SFP for fiscal year 2005-2006 biennium to the estimated fiscal year 2025-2026 biennium.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is really, I think, a really good graph. First of all, it's outstanding materials, you guys. So great work. It's a lot of work getting all this, you can only imagine. But I think this is really a great graph when you look at this deal in the blue there with, you know, the FMRs, and you can see how that thing's trending. And that's our coal issue. You know, it started 7, 8 years ago. But I think the good news on there is that gray, and you look at that little investment income back in 05, 06, and how that thing is starting to get bigger and bigger. And this 1% severance that's going to go on the common school count next 8 years. There's a lot more good news. And I tell you, if we could monetize some state sections in Teton, I mean, you could double the size of the common school count in a couple of strokes of the pen. And it's really, really amazing. So I think that's some of the more good news. But this FMR piece, that's a real issue. So, but anyway, thank you for all this is a great graph. Thank you.
Now, let me say about this graph, I couldn't understand it in the whole and found it to be of no value. And I think the difference is some people look at these things visually, and a graph like this makes a lot of sense to them. I want to see the actual numbers. I look at a graph like this and I say, how does that translate into a number? And I have difficulty seeing some of the proportions. So I'm going to request, and on this one in particular, but in general, in the future, when you do one of these graphs, give us a table that shows the real numbers. And that's just, you know, it's a difference in how different people perceive things. I need to see the real numbers. And the information looks to me like it ought to be useful, but I can't make any sense out of it in this form. So request that you get in the future, and particularly follow up with this one with a table with the numbers, because I look at that and I say, does it really change? What's it really? It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I just want to go back on page 7. And I think I understand why, but I want to hear an explanation of why we do the FMR swap. And what concerns were there at the time, if you recall, and what would be the implications if we did it otherwise?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, and I'll let Ms. Hytrek weigh in as well, but your constitution requires the income on your common school account to be expended for the purpose of K-12 education. And so when we exceed the spending policy amount, we take federal mineral royalties, which aren't constitutionally protected revenues, and we transfer a like amount in excess of that spending policy amount, and we transfer it to the reserve account, the common school permanent spending policy reserve account. So we just, the money's fungible in that school foundation program account. So the purpose for that is to ensure that the full income off the common school account is deposited within the common school and income account, then transferred to your school foundation program account. So the reason why we do that FMR swap is to ensure that only FMRs are being transferred out to your reserve account and not the actual investment earnings on the common school account. That's, we're really ensuring that those funds earned on the common school account are actually expended on K-12 education. That's the purpose for it.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And that's one thing that's always bugged me. It's the first statement you said that all income off of this account should go to the SFP, School Foundation Program. And not all year. Is that correct? Is that what you said?
Mr. Chairman, the income shall be used for purposes of K-12 education. It goes into the common school and income account. You could use those funds for capital construction, major maintenance. You've chosen as a legislature to put it in, to transfer those to the School Foundation Program account. Just technical point there, but you could use it for any K-12 purposes.
Mr. Chairman, my question back to you though is do we have the authority, if we get it in excess, if we get income in excess and we roll it back into the common school land account, that's not helping schools, that's helping a fund. So my question is, can you in fact do excess earnings off of that back into the common school land account, or does it have to go into schools? I mean, and it's a further, you can answer my question.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, again, I think it's Wyoming Constitutional Article 7, Section 6, which requires that the funds held in trust for the exclusive benefit of the public schools and the investment income shall be used for public schools. And so, you know, the flow of those funds is to put it in the common school income account. And then under current policy, it's to move those funds then from the income account to your School Foundation Program account. And I think you utilize all those funds under the current structure for K-12 education. As I indicated, the swap of those funds in excess of your spending policy amount is a like amount from federal minimum royalties. Hope that helps.
See if I can get a little further clarification. The issue is, could we take income off these permanent funds? Not spend it on anything but schools, but put some of it back into the fund where it's really then is available then for income off of that fund strictly available for the public schools. Does that meet the constitutional test, or is there a constitutional problem? And I guess it's really a question for the legal counsel.
And Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers, that's not something that I'm here to give an answer on today, but it's certainly something I will look into and get back to you with a definitive answer. I think I understand the question, but that nuanced argument about whether the interest could go back into the corpus, I haven't looked at that issue specifically.
I suspect for the foreseeable future, it may be somewhat of an academic question, but I think there is a real question there in terms of going forward. And is that swap to the federal mineral royalties really necessary, or is it, I can see why they took the precaution, but is it really something we have to do? I think is the question. And if in the future, when we do have money, can we put some of it back into the common school account, or are we obliged to spend the whole amount? And I don't know whether there's any legal precedent on it or not, or whether maybe one of those things is just plain unclear.
Mr. Chairman. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The whole issue of the FMRs and the income all going to the School Foundation Program, the only reason it got complicated is trying to effectuate a spending policy. That was the whole issue, to try to limit it to 5%. If you take the spending policy out of the equation, all the money that comes out of the all the income that flows into the school foundation program just flows there, and it does right now. It flows there. The only reason we do something different is to try to effectuate the spending policy. So it all comes into the school foundation program, but we then pull money out of FMRs, which reduces income from another spot and puts it into the reserve account. That's the only reason that happens, is to try to effectuate a spending policy. So the way to fix it is to drop the spending policy if you want to just create more cash flow in the current term. Thank you.
The problem you get into with that is a lot of the theory on how you imagine what basically is a big endowment we've got is to try to even out the ebbs and flows of it with a spending policy so that you don't fluctuate the amount that you can spend wildly every year. So I can see why they did it. If you do away with the spending policy, then you've got to carry some big reserves somewhere else because you will have fluctuations in the earnings, particularly from that source.
Mr. Chairman, so back on page 9, we then go into the school foundation program appropriations, and primarily the appropriations from the school foundation program go to the districts. These appropriations can be categorized into 4 different groups. So entitlement payments to the districts, categorical program funding, additional assistance outside of the school finance funding model, and other needs. So sometimes funding for state agencies related to those K-12 needs. Figure 6 on page 10 identifies the total historic and estimated appropriations from the SFP. This is just a total number. Transitioning to school capital construction funding, there are 3 accounts for school capital construction: the school major maintenance sub-account within the SIPA, the school mineral royalties account, and the school capital construction account. Beginning with the school major maintenance sub-account, this was created in the 2018 budget session to direct 45% of the investment earnings from the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund that could be directed to the SIPA, direct that 45% to the school major maintenance sub-account. In 2019, the legislature guaranteed this amount, and the flow chart of the Permanent Wyoming Minerals Trust Fund spending policy for fiscal year 2021 is at the back of this memo in attachment B. Moving to the school lands mineral royalties account, this was created in the 2019 general session, and it receives 1/3 of the proceeds on state mineral royalties, which previously were directed to the school capital construction account. It's important to note that while these state royalties have usually been directed for capital construction, it is just specified that they should be used to support public schools. So they don't necessarily have to go to capital construction. Moving to the school capital construction account, historically, it has received revenues from COLIS bonuses, state mineral royalties, and FMRs. And since the decline of COLIS bonuses, the legislature has made the adjustments that I had mentioned earlier, and has increased the amount of state royalties available for construction, and has directed those investment earnings towards capital construction. It is important to note, however, that while this has created more funding available for capital construction, there's no permanent mechanism currently to transfer funds from the school major maintenance sub-account or the state mineral royalties account to the school capital construction account. In the 2020 budget session, the legislature did authorize the transfer of those funds to the school capital construction account through the budget bill.
Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. just a real quick question, but you include these revenues in your estimates, even though it's not statutory, we have to do it in the budget. And that'd be a simple fix if this committee wanted to run a bill to just transfer those. And then it doesn't have to be a budget issue every 2 years. But you do include them. Okay, very good. Thank you. And I would say, Mr. Chairman, there's another excellent chart on page 11. And as a visual person, you see that in 19, you see where Coley's bonus went away, 17, 18, the orange, see the big orange. The big orange built a lot of stuff, rebuilt the state. And the big orange is coal. And part of this coal deficit now has been made up of legislative increments. You can see the gray is state mineral royalties. We just went back to follow on the Constitution. And then the orange is half, 45% of the SIPA. So we're moved to solve those problems. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Matt, and I'm not going to get all the names right, but the flow of money used to be the school foundation program, then it went to the holding account, then it went to school capital construction. That was my memory of the flow down the pipe. And so when I look at this chart, I don't see that flow that would have been the holding account to so we would have had school foundation program money eventually would have probably flowed to school capital construction, and yet I don't see that here. And maybe it's just buried in that reflection of.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Summers, we look at those as transfers, not necessarily direct revenues. So for the members of the committee, some historical background on what Representative Summers is discussing. Prior to the 2017-2018 biennium, I believe it was enacted in the 2005 sixth biennium, the legislature directed any revenues or any balance in excess of $100 million in the school foundation program account to be transferred to the school capital construction account. And there was a short period of time that any revenues or any fund balance in excess of $0 in the school capital construction account went to this temporary account called the permanent land fund holding account. And that built up to about $550 million. I think it was like 534 or maybe a little bit more. I'll just round figures, $550 million. That was there for a temporary time. And then that full balance was then transferred to the back up to the school foundation program account. And so between a 10-year period, any funds in excess of $100 million from the school foundation program account to the CAPCON account to this holding account, and then it came back up to the school foundation program account. And so it was just this temporary account that held revenues. It essentially it was to prevent it from going to the permanent fund, because there was a mechanism in the school capital construction account to move funds to the common school account. So that's some historical perspective on some of the maneuvering of these accounts. But that transfer from the school foundation program account to the school CAPCON account was eliminated, I believe, in the 2017 session or the 2018. I can't remember which year. And then that permanent land fund holding account has been eliminated as well.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. But it's my recollection, and I don't remember the dollar, but a substantial amount of money moved from the school foundation program account to school capital construction. And it's not reflected on this chart. And that's my, and I think it's a good historical perspective. If we would have kept that money instead of flowed it south to the school capital construction, SFP wouldn't be in the bind it is today. But what is that number? That's my question.
Mr. Chairman, I'll have to go back. We have those figures in a prior memo. I can run me up some numbers during the break and get you a number. I can't remember the amount that transferred from the school foundation program account to the school CAPCON account. But I will tell you, $550 million did come back up to it. So you have to net that against whatever is transferred out.
More final follow-up, Mr. Chairman, and my good colleague to my right over here mentioned it. And at times it was rated, and one of the rates created the Hathaway. that flow. It's my understanding that when it got in there, then it flowed. So I do want to know how much flowed out of the school foundation program to other pieces.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, to that point, the Hathaway account and the higher education endowment account intercepted funds that would have gone to the school foundation program account. So it didn't necessarily hit the school foundation program account. The legislature intercepted prior to the deposit of the school foundation program account. Federal minimum royalties in the 2005 session, they set up mechanisms to capture 400 million for the Hathaway account and 105 million for the higher education endowment account. And then there was also, I think, 50 million in Coley's bonus money that they intercepted that would have gone to the school capital construction account to further increase the higher education endowment.
I'll say, yes, I remember that as being accurate. And I think Representative Harshman was involved in that one too. We put that bill through. And that really is separate from the school capital construction question. We had a tremendous mineral boom, and I think part of the motivation in using that funding was to keep it from being rated for other purposes than education. So it wound up funding the Hathaway. Representative Summers' question really raised an intriguing thing for me. Are you telling us that part of the funding for school capital construction that occurred post Campbell decision came out of the school foundation program account? Is that correct, or did it all get put back in?
Mr. Chairman, both. So in the 2009-10 biennium, there's actually appropriations directly out of the school foundation program account for CapCon, somewhere around $200 million. But we've also, or the legislature has also transferred funds from the school foundation program account to the school capital construction account to fund major maintenance and school capital construction projects. But money has also transferred back up through this process from flowing from the school foundation program, school capital construction account, PLF holding account, and then it's come back up to the school foundation program account. We have historical charts on that. We didn't get into the details of that in this memorandum, but we can certainly identify those in historical documents.
Am I correct in understanding that there was a significant net expenditure of school foundation monies for capital construction?
Mr. Chairman, that is accurate.
Okay. Now, the follow-up question is the item that's shown in yellow here, the spending policy amount, starting with where we are right now in 2021. Is that money that can be used for purposes other than schools, or is that school operating money? What spending policy account amount and what are the restrictions on those funds?
Mr. Chairman, that spending policy amount is in relation to the school major maintenance sub-account within the SIPA. And so it's the money that's directed from the SIPA to that school major maintenance sub-account.
And Mr. Chairman, to add on to that, that money, that's investment income on your permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund, which is first deposited in your state general fund.
So it's my understanding then is it's money that could be used for any general fund purpose. So essentially, when we see that bar, we are taking from state general fund purposes that, for instance, could go to mental health and say we're going to spend it on major maintenance. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, I think that's accurate. Those are not strictly exclusive for the benefit of K-12 education. Those monies could be utilized in a number of ways that the policymakers have in the past.
general royalties that are showing on that and show all along, but are now more important. That's monies that could be spent for school operating as opposed to capital construction. Is that right?
Mr. Chairman, yes, that's correct.
So what I'm seeing here is that we're starting to fund school capital construction out of the operating budget for schools and out of the operating budget for all the rest of the state government. Is that a correct understanding?
Mr. Chairman, yes, that would be correct.
Now I'll make my standard request. Even I can see the chart here is showing that the coal lease bonus went away. We all know that. And that's given us a problem. Could you produce a table that shows the actual numbers involved here?
Mr. Chairman, yes, we can.
And same request while we're at it on the figure on the next page.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we can do that as well. Kind of going back to page 11, figure 7 is the revenues by source for capital construction. And it is assumed that the school major maintenance sub-account, the revenues from that and the school mineral royalties account will be transferred to school capital construction, which is why you see those numbers in the estimated 2021 through 2026 biennium.
And I will make one observation directed at the school people in the audience, that what we're starting to see here is we can't get the capital construction under some kind of control some way. It's going to start hitting you on the operating side, and already potentially is. And I think that's something we have to think very seriously about.
Mr. Chairman.
Attachment A, there's a thing in there, it says 5% of the 5-year average of the corpus 2021. What's that 5% about? What happened to it? I did not understand the bottom part of that chart. Could you explain that a little better? The attachment A chart, the very bottom one.
So, Mr. Chairman, just to kind of walk you through this, so the corpus, the market value, the 5-year average is $3.9 billion. 5% of that is your $196.1 million dollar figure. So 5% of $3.9 billion is what we refer to as your spending policy amount. That's the 5% of the 5-year market average. That is guaranteed through your common school permanent fund reserve account. So if your investment income through interest, dividends, and realized capital gains does not equal that 196.1 million, then your reserve account guarantees that amount.
Okay. And has that guarantee in fact been kicking in?
So, Mr. Chairman, the long-term profile exhausts that reserve account. So we assume that it's going to guarantee it through, I think, the 23-24 biennium. Based on fiscal year 21 interest, dividends, and realized capital gains, that guarantee was not necessary because you exceeded that 5% spending policy amount. So you actually exceeded the spending policy. So you're gonna actually move funds from your school foundation program account to the reserve account. That's the differential. That is the difference between your spending policy and actual income. Did I just complicate that?
I think I need to talk to you offline to really understand what's going on here.
Really, this flow chart is just illustrating what the market value is of your corpus, what that 5% spending policy is, and then identifying those amounts that is equal to your 5% spending policy amount and whatever your balance is in your reserve account, what guarantees that investment income. I hope that helps. We'll talk offline.
And committee, I got a question for you. Flatly, I did not understand attachment B at all. Is that just me, or is that attachment B confusing to the rest of the committee as well? Do we want to attachment B?
Spending policy. I served 4 years on a probe, so I understand it.
Okay.
Chairman, this has really been pretty much unchanged since, 2002, when we really adopted the kind of Harvard Yale trust model and went to this 5% of the 5-year rolling average. The only thing that's really changed are these LSRA refuel and this SIPA as part of this 5%. Used to be just 5% of the general fund. And then I think former President Bebout and I were both chairing appropriations back in the day when that bill passed. And so anyway, it was a way to because we know we have these projects, and that we saw the end of coal lease bonus coming and the end of massive FMR payments. And so we wanted to look at a way of, we're probably always going to have to build a school or build a state facility or those kind of things. So it was a way to look forward and fund those things. But other than that, it's really unchanged. I would tell you again, your CapFin group is working to kind of even modernize this more into more of a, an endowment model where the spend every year, and we move forward. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Mr. We'll work with you offline. These are, there's a lot of movement going on between accounts, and that makes it a little bit more complex to understand.
At this point, we're scheduled to have public comment on the stuff we've been going through. We're going to do that. I would say to particularly the district people, you can see the amount of uncertainty we're up against in terms of the funding, not only the complexities of our system, but the fundamentals in terms of we simply do not know what's going to happen to our mineral revenues that are a major portion of our school funding. And in the past, we've been able to basically, when we've had a shortfall in that area, make it up. I voted for spending general fund on schools any number of times over the years. But right now it's impinging on the whole state government's revenues. And there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty. I would say to the districts, that's something you're going to have to take careful consideration of when you deal with what you do with the money that comes in from the feds, either directly or indirectly. Because if we do go over that cliff we've talked about, and it's not clear to me, is that 3 years away? Is that 5 years away? Are we going to manage to dodge the bullet somehow, get our oil production back and not deplete our reserves? We simply don't know. But if we do go over that, I think you will see something that is very unpleasant, both in terms of the tax increases that will be caused and in terms of some massive spending cuts that I'm afraid would impinge on what we can offer in the way of education. So my message to districts is treat that federal money with a great deal of caution, because if it gets perceived that it got frittered away on extras, I think we could all land in a lot of trouble. So with that, we're going to take a break for a good 10 minutes, try to get going just before 11:30 and come back and have the public testimony on this. We're running slow, but we're trying to understand this. And I hope it's the members, and I'm be interested in feedback, particularly the newer members, are finding it useful in terms of understanding where we really are and how our system really works. So with that, we'll take a break and be back by 11:30.
We're about at least a half hour behind time, and by the time we get through a 10-minute break, we're gonna be more than that, so we may need to make some adjustments. I think we need this next topic, I think we need to give them their full, we have an
The full
hour,
time.
hour and 15 minutes scheduled for it.
Yeah,
So
we'll need the full
we
time.
may need to break before lunch or run into
Yeah.
that 12 o'clock.
Yeah,
But we're about 45 minutes off right now.
yeah.
We will be.
And we're going to stay there, I'm afraid. Oh, is this useful for you?
It is. It is, Senator. I mean, it's.
Yes, we do. The next item is public comment, any of the finance stuff that we've just heard. Anybody here present want to comment at this time? Anybody here present want to comment at this time? Seeing none. The next item on the agenda is the what we call the K-12 education program. LSO, you want to go ahead and proceed with that?
Sure thing, Mr. Chairman. In your notebooks, this is the next memo. After that, actually, there's a in your memo there, or in your notebook, there, it's the next memo or issue brief. It's the Wyoming's K-12 education program, dated July 2021. And this speaks to kind of the first charge that Ms. Hytrek discussed with you this morning, is to define what you actually are to cost out. And so this morning we'll focus on what the legislature's response was to the Campbell 1 case, and setting up its statutory requirements for what students are required to know. And then what the state board is charged to do under that charge from the legislature, and then summarize the changes and the comparison of those standards across states. That was some of the work that was done in the 2017 recalibration effort. Primarily, the legislature set up this educational program with what is deemed the Common Core of skills and knowledge in statute. And again, this was in response to the course directive to define and specify what a proper education is for a Wyoming child. And so the legislature has done that throughout various parts in Title 21. It, as I indicated, established what we deem as the Common Core of skills and knowledge. And we'll go through that in detail on pages 2 and 3. And then in those skills and knowledge areas, the state board is charged to establish standards for each of the school districts to teach and measure through an assessment system. Also, part of the charge of the state board is to review those every 9 years. Initially, that was set up for every 5 years to review each of those standards that they set every 5 years, but the legislature has modified that to every 9 years, and they report back those results of those studies to the Joint Education Committee, and the Joint Education Committee can report back any findings that they have to the legislature. To ensure that school districts are teaching those standards or meeting those standards, the State Board of Education also then evaluates and accredits school districts, district assessment systems that are required to be established. And so one of the ways that the legislatures ensure that districts are ensuring that those areas are being taught is through the accreditation process and requiring districts to teach those standards. The standards are also set up to ensure that the Common Core of knowledge and skills are rigorous enough that a student upon a graduation from Wyoming High School can enter the University of Wyoming or a community college, or be prepared for workforce or any vocational or technical training. And then also, and this comes out of the Campbell language, Campbell 1 language, to be a participant in the political system and have an opportunity to compete both intellectually and economically in the society. So the state has also in statute established minimum graduation requirements. And then it also charges the State Board of Education within each of those standards that they define for each of the areas to establish graduation standards for students to achieve. And as I mentioned as well, districts are required to establish their own district assessment systems to measure how students are performing on these content and performance standards. Finally, one of the charges again is for this State Board of Education to establish a statewide assessment system. And this is the summative assessment in the spring of each year that measures each student's performance against these performance standards. As I indicated, the legislature has made significant modifications to various statutes that govern these charges. And I think Ms. Hytrek discussed this earlier in the 2010 recalibration. One of the results of that was setting up an accountability system. And it first started off primarily at the leader and teacher area. Now it's primarily at the school and district level with some leader accountability as well. As I mentioned, initially the review of those standards were every 5 years. Now it's every 9 years. And the legislature has also modified the district assessment system. It used to be what was deemed the body of evidence system. Now it's just a district assessment system. And the legislature has also modified the diploma system. It used to be a tiered diploma system. Now we just have a straight diploma system. There's no differentiation between a high school diploma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could you clarify that? Just kind of help me understand that, Mr. Wilmar. What do you mean by there's no differentiation anymore? It's just, if you could clarify that for me, I appreciate it.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Nyman, the State Board of Education used to have different graduation standards that had to be achieved to have a advanced diploma or a standard diploma or a diploma for students with severe cognitive disabilities. Now they're just a high school diploma with minimum graduation requirements. This is common amongst other states. They used to be dictated in statute that there used to be these various graduation requirements or diplomas, but now it doesn't speak to that in statute anymore. So those are just some of the examples that I'm providing on technical changes in the statutes. Table 1 of on page 2 of this issue brief summarizes the changes to the Common Core of Knowledge and Skills areas that the legislature has made since 1998. This was done in the 2018 session. You can see on the right-hand column under the Common Core Skills, subparagraph C, keyboarding was deleted and computational thinking was inserted. And then on page 3 at the top of that table, subparagraph M was repealed, applied technology, and then subparagraph O was added for computer science. Those have been the only changes since 1997's original Common Core of Knowledge and Skills that were amended. I will tell you the standards that the State Board of Education has underneath of these areas, those have been modified multiple times. So that while it doesn't look like the legislature has done much since 1997, underneath this, the State Board has repromulgated rules many times in each of these areas.
Mr. Chairman, thanks. And so the Common Core Skills has to be embedded basically within the coursework, which is kind of the Common Core of Knowledge somehow. My question is it, and I don't remember from 2017 and APA's evaluation between states, is it common to have a skills category in the educational program? Because I don't recall, are we one of the few to do that, or is that fairly common?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Summers, I don't know if other states call them skills versus and knowledge areas. In this issue brief later on, I'll highlight some of what other states do, and they do call out financial literacy, they call out library literacy, which could fit within our skills categories. The State Board of Education embeds these within their standards, and they're measured through the district assessment system. I hope that helps.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And just to follow up, I know in fact that like financial skills are part of the basket of goods in other states. My question is there this second layer, and this is a question you can find out for later, is there a second layer like this in other states, and perhaps district members when they testify will know as well?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers, we'll look into that. I can't recall from the work done in the 2017 recalibration if there was a distinction between knowledge areas and skills areas in other states or not. I just don't know. But we'll certainly look into that, maybe follow up in detail on that report. Moving on, Mr. Chairman, additional requirements within statute, and this is under Wyoming Statute 219101, and this was established as part of the response to the Campbell 1 case. For grades 1 through 8, the legislature requires the state board and school districts to emphasize reading, writing, and mathematics. So for all these Common Core of knowledge areas and skills areas, the focus for grades 1 through 8 was really for reading, writing, and mathematics. The other areas weren't as emphasized or called out in statute for those grades. Additionally, and this is primarily a federal requirement too, but the programs must also navigate requirements for children with disabilities. But Wyoming also specifically calls out that opportunities or these standards shall be provided for students with identified as gifted and talented as well. Another area that was specifically called out in this section of law was that school districts were to endeavor to maintain a class size ratio of 1 to 20. Initially, that was changed in 2012 in grades kindergarten through 3 to 16 students per one teacher. School districts are also encouraged to establish co-curricular activity programs that are not otherwise provided by the school district. And then since school year 2002-2003, school districts have been required to provide foreign language instruction to students in kindergarten through 2nd grade. And then finally, under this section of law, the legislature required both K-12 education and students in post-secondary education that are supported by public funds to instruct students in the essentials of Wyoming and the United States constitutions. And that'd be 3 years in grades kindergarten through 8, and 1 year in secondary grades and 1 year in college grades. And they may not receive a high school diploma or college degree if they don't pass a examination on those requirements. So outside of 219101 and 102, the legislature has established other educational program requirements. In 2006, the legislature charged the Department of Education in consultation with the Department of Transportation to establish standards for driver's education programs. In the 2017 session, the legislature ensured or required that the social studies component within the Common Core of knowledge contained standards related to cultural heritage, history, and contemporary contributions of American Indians. In 2018, the legislature authorized school districts to educate students on child sexual abuse prevention as part of the health and safety knowledge area.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Just a quick question back on the foreign language thing. So in 2002 through 3, districts have been required to provide foreign language instructions. in K through 2. So now it's it's throughout the entire grades, right? So it went from something else. So before, explain what there was before and then what we have now.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Summers, I don't know that I have a really good understanding prior to the 2002, 2003 school year. The Department of Education might be a better source for that.
Okay. Let me see if I can hear. What happened was that Representative Hageman got this put into a bill that was coming through, this requirement. And a number of the rest of us supported it. I was one of the ones in the Senate that helped push it through, and that we agreed with what he'd done when it came to conference. What happened was the brain research that is being done has been very enlightening in this area. And it shows very clearly that the window of opportunity to easily learn a foreign language and learn it the same way you learn your native language starts closing around age 8. It's just the way the human brain development works. And so what he was trying to do was respond to that and initiate instruction, which was not occurring at all in these primary grades. And people hadn't realized that that was the best time to do the teaching. Frankly, I think that's something this committee needs to look at, because it is something that the science does show. Makes a lot of sense as to when you ought to a foreign language, but we're not following up on it properly. You've got some total immersion programs in some of the larger school districts, and it may not all be larger. So I think it may be in some of the smaller ones too. They seem to work pretty well, but there's no systematic instruction. We aren't taking advantage of the native speakers that we do have in the community in some of these languages, where maybe you team with a certified teacher, a teacher's aide who is a native speaker, can help out. There's a bunch of things could be done to be much more effective in this program. I think it is not been as effective as it needs to be. There've been several attempts to repeal it, and they have failed in part because the science does show that's the best time to teach a foreign language. So I think it's fodder for further committee instruction. Co-Chairman Paxton.
It may be from a scientific standpoint the time to teach that, but when you look at the requirements, we've kind of shifted from a developmental kindergarten kind of a situation to an academic, and there's a time constraint there. So I think we're asking our teachers to set some priorities there. And, we're putting more and more emphasis and more pressure on our teachers at these primary grades to make sure that those kids are reading and all those kinds of things. Is that more important than the foreign language? I think that there has to be a choice made there. I don't think that you can do both effectively. And so I hear from primary teachers that they don't value that foreign language thing nearly like maybe legislators do. And given the time constraints, I have to kind of think that maybe it's more important to have them reading by third grade than it is to have the foreign language thing.
Mr. Chairman, I know we're getting off base and having kind of a conversation back here, but on the foreign language question, I've looked at this content and performance standards, and it is a peculiar thing. If you look at it for career technical training, we have content and performance standards written specifically for elementary students. It's, understanding different occupations, things like that. But even though we have it specifically written in the statute that we're supposed to have K through 2 foreign language standards, we don't. if you look at the standards, they're broken out into novice, intermediate, advanced. And I might be oversimplifying those categories, but more or less, that's how those standards are written. And so if you look at the novice, those are written not for an elementary school child. They're written for someone who's taking a foreign language class, Spanish one, French one, starting in 7th or 8th grade or 9th grade. And so that's been a question that I've had with the state board. They're rewriting their content performance standards for foreign language right now. Is, you know, to the elementary school demands. I think that begs the question. I mean, is the expectation that they learn colors and alphabet shapes? Maybe during gym class, Penny Simon says some basic commands like jump in Spanish or another foreign language. So I do think we need to grapple with that. But the bigger question is, we have it written specifically in statute. We don't have content performance standards, and we have a lot of schools that don't teach it at all because they don't like to. So what does our statute mean then? If a district, if our state board, if we aren't doing our job, what kind of penalty, what kind of way, how do we ever get there? Do you have any thought?
Mr. Chairman and Senator Ellison, I think gets back to Representative Summers' question. We'll go back to prior to the 2002, 2003 school year to see what the state board's rules had for the student content performance standards. I don't know what they looked like back then, if they were specific just only to middle and high school grades, but that's one way we'd be able to see what was done prior to that requirement. To Senator Ellis's question on penalty, I think the penalty, if you don't meet these educational requirements in our statute, is accreditation. And so if you aren't accredited, you know, at work, yeah, I think that's the teeth in the law that you have today. And hope that helps.
I will say, I do think it is something this committee is going to have to, over time, look at. I do think it is an age-appropriate time to teach a foreign language. I think that's important. And I suspect one of the things you'll find is that the teaching the foreign language will help them with English. I think that's a very common finding, that seeing it done differently is helpful. So I think that's going to be a matter we'll probably debate over quite a period of time. But it is there. The origin of it was Representative Hageman. I don't think the school district did anything before. I think he was simply knowledgeable before the research was going.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to finalize the thoughts on the educational program provisions outside of 21.9, 101, and 102, tangentially related to your educational program is the Pathway Success Curriculum. And school districts are required to offer those courses, and those courses are to be aligned to the uniform content performance standards that the State Board of Education establishes. The final piece of this memo relates to how does Wyoming compare to other states. And so during the 2017 recalibration effort, legislature's consultants were charged with evaluating both the regional states and what they deemed as high performing states. And the regional states included all the contiguous states to Wyoming plus North Dakota. And then the high performing states were Indiana, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, Vermont, and Virginia. And they looked at 4 areas in relation to our educational program. The first is a content standard or content areas where standards were established in each of those states. They did an in-depth review on English, language arts, mathematics, and science. And they looked at other of these states if they had scholarship programs similar to the Hathaway Scholarship program, and also the graduation requirements. And then they looked at what other populations of students do these states require standards for. As indicated, of the 13 states, all of the states that they reviewed had standards in English language arts, mathematics, science, social studies, fine and performing arts, foreign language, and health and physical education. The career technical education standards amongst all these states varied. And then 4 other states had library standards, 3 states had financial literacy standards, and 2 states had specific driver's education standards. So of those other, those initial standards areas, all the states had pretty much all the same standards Wyoming has established or identified in the Common Core of Knowledge. Related to the in-depth review, there were only 4 states related to English language arts that had different standards in Wyoming, and those were Colorado and Nebraska in the regional states, and for the high-performing states, Massachusetts and Virginia. And then for mathematics, only 3 states vary differently than Wyoming. Again, Nebraska, and then Indiana and Virginia for the high-performing states. And then for science, again, only 3 states had different standards from Wyoming. Those included Utah in the regional category, and then for the high-performing states, Indiana for grades 6 through 12, and Virginia. Related to graduation standards, all the states in the comparison required at least 4 years of English language arts and 3 years of mathematics. And I kind of alluded to this earlier. Some of the states with tier diplomas required 4 years of mathematics. Wyoming only requires 3 years. And then similar with Wyoming, all states required at least 3 years of science and social studies. Some states required foreign language as part of their graduation requirements. New Jersey required at least a year for all of their students. And then to achieve an advanced diploma, Indiana and Virginia required at least 3 years of foreign language. Wyoming doesn't require foreign language as part of its minimum graduation requirements in statute.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And as we get that report on the foreign language, and maybe there's a way to go either back in this data or look at other data, what are states requiring within their, I guess, within their standards for foreign language? So we have a little bit here, but we don't really know what is being required.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers, are you wanting to know like what does an advanced or a proficient student need to know for Spanish or French or German? I mean, that's what the standards are intended to identify, is what is the minimum level of proficiency required? Is that what you're looking for?
No, more, I guess more what grades. So for example, New Jersey required at least a year for all students, okay? So what do we require? We require it to be we require the class to be offered, but we don't require it to be taught. Is that correct? Or we don't require a student to take it. Is that fair?
Mr.
Chairman, they
Chairman,
would have to in grade school because you got to take every class they give you, at least that's what I thought.
yeah, so Mr. Chairman, this is specifically related to the graduation requirements. So we're primarily looking at students in grades 9 through 12. And for New Jersey, at least 1 year has to be required for all students. And then, as they indicated in the report, Indiana and Virginia, if you want an advanced diploma, you are required to have at least 3 years. I will say there is not a requirement in our graduation requirements, but for the Hathaway Success Curriculum, prior to, I think, a couple years ago, foreign language, at least 2 years had to be sequenced for foreign language for the honors and performance success curriculum. That's no longer a requirement for those scholarship programs. You have to have, I believe, 2 years of CTE, foreign language, or performing arts. And so, yeah, I think that's right. So I would say prior to the change in 2019, there was somewhat of a requirement in your statutes for foreign language if a student had it, if the student was going to achieve the honors performance of Hathaway. Mr. Chairman, related to career technical education requirements for graduation standards, these varied across a lot of the states. Half the states required some form of these courses for graduation, and of the states that required, they were primarily elective courses, course options. There wasn't a specific course that had to be taken. New Jersey and Montana require at least 1 year of career technical education for all their students. And Indiana is similar with the states, required the elective choices to be college and career education courses with a diploma for technical honors. And then Virginia includes completion of a pathway program as part of its standard diploma. And then there was some other various requirements for some of the states, such as fine arts, humanities, physical education, health, and personal finance and economics. As I previously indicated, the Pathway Scholarship Program shall be taught amongst schools or offered and aligned to the content performance standards. And these generally, when the scholarship program was established, they generally align with the university's admission requirements. And then finally, when APA reviewed the Hathaway Scholarship Programs areas, they were comparable universities in the benchmark states had similar coursework requirements to the Hathaway program. And then finally, the last area that APA reviewed was the special populations. And as I indicated in my opening remarks, the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act requires all states to provide a free and appropriate education to all students in the least restrictive environment. There was generally minimal variation among these requirements for special education students across all these states, which is not surprising. And all the states have achievement standards or alternative achievement standards in English and language arts and mathematics and science. And then Colorado, Indiana, Massachusetts, and Virginia had additional alternative standards in social studies and history for students with disabilities. Except for 2 states, the age range for students with disabilities is 3 through 21. And then the other areas, 2 areas that APA looked at were English language learner students. All states identify students through some form of an assessment, and gifted and talented students, the definitions really varied across states on how to define or measure what a gifted and talented student was. And less than half the states mandated that how these students should be served. With that, Mr. Chairman, I hope that provides the committee a good background on the educational program requirements established by statute. Microphone.
We've got all these standards. What difference are they actually making in the classroom? You know, I want to understand, is this a theoretical exercise, or what's it really doing to the teacher in the classroom and the instruction that's actually offered? I've heard everything from they're extraordinarily important to they're so complicated that nobody follows them. And I don't know where the truth is. So I'm really hoping as we get to the state board and perhaps just comment from the district and other members of the public that we get some understanding of what kind of differences do these standards actually make to the instruction that goes on. Second is a more specific question on the very last item on the English language learner. These are people for whom English is a second language. Am I right in understanding that's what we're talking about here?
Mr. Chairman, correct. So, primarily, these are students that don't speak English as their first language.
And the specific complaint that I have heard was that there's a federal requirement in this area. And I don't quite understand whether it's a matter of accepting federal funds or whether it's one of these the federal government is opposed totally on us, that students take it unless they test out, and that some of the special ed students or have a relative, a grandparent that is not an English speaker. They're perfectly good English speakers. Feds say you've got to test out, and some of these people can't successfully take the test. And there's a catch-22 that's catching some students and requiring instruction that's just unnecessary. And is that a true problem, or is it a very isolated incident? I don't know. But I have heard that particular complaint.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'll have to defer to the Department of Education, their expertise on that. I don't know.
That's one I'm interested in following up on, whether that's really, feds really have caused us a problem there or not. Mr. Chairman, I think unless there's further questions, we're probably at the point where we need to break for lunch. I know there's a fast food joint down the street across the road where you can probably get the basics of lunch. Where else in this community is a possibility?
Well, the Wolf, of course, and just about any other place that may be open, just, you'll just have to go check it out. This really isn't my town, I live 20 miles away, so.
You're a lot closer than any of the rest of us.
I can tell you where to eat in Riverside.
But I can tell you it's far enough away, you won't get back in time. If we break for lunch now, is 1:15 a reasonable time to resume, or do we need to go to 1:30?
Well, I guess whenever we have a quorum, try for 1:15, and if we have a quorum by then, we'll take off.
Okay, we'll try to start